welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. Not the first time I've been likened to a little piggy. It's usually the eyes. Mother could be very cruel. Now, I'd like to expand on that little piggy, but first, I should warn you that in the programme you're about to hear, I intend to get to grips with the world of financial markets, investments, profit and greed. But before you reach for your radio's off switch with an urgency hitherto reserved for Moneybox Live, let me explain why I'm doing this. Let's look at that title. When we're young, This Little Piggy Goes to Market involves nothing more sinister than unwanted toe contact from a slightly odd uncle. We like to picture that little piggy cheerfully heading off to market in a yellow waistcoat with a neatly knotted little scarf around his neck. It's only some years later that we realise that the pig was in fact as deluded as we were. Far from being the trader about to enjoy the cut and thrust of a day's bidding, he was the goods, and the only reason that he was still alive as he headed off to market was so that his flesh didn't spoil in transit. How many of us are like that little piggy, gamely trotting off to work every morning, perky as you like, blithely ignoring the fact that we have somehow become confused with the livestock, that we are being jostled and crowded with other equally deluded individuals on our way to the abattoir? Does it have to be like that? Do we have to play the role of the little piggy when it comes to the markets? Can we at least buy a share in the slaughter? Here to help me find out is presenter of Radio 4's More or Less, a Financial Times columnist, the thinking woman's Robert Peston. Tim Harford. You are a man of enormous intellectual breadth and experience in this field. Can I ask you, first of all, my joke was quite funny, wasn't it?
Well, Simon, I want you to feel that this is a safe space, so I'm going to say yes, very funny.
Thank you very much. Also, and we'll be coming back to Tim for more and lengthier enlightened insights later, I have invited Editor-in-Chief of Money Week, Merryn Somerset-Webb, to join us. Now, she can't be with us in person. She lives in Edinburgh, and seeing as I can't afford her advice in real life, I thought I'd ask her on the show and get it for free, or at least with your licence fee. I began by asking Merryn a very simple, fundamental question. What is an investment? Not as simple as it sounds. For example, when a glossy magazine urges you to invest in a really good pair of shoes, is that really investing, or is that just spending your money in a more boring way than usual? Merryn, is that investing?
A nonsense use of the word. What defines an actual investment, something that you want as an investment, is that it will provide you with a regular return, but also protect the capital value of your original stake.
And in that respect, no pair of shoes can ever possibly qualify, however robust.
Unless that pair of shoes is going to give you a new pair of shoelaces every year, it's not an investment.
Thank you, Merryn. I'd always thought as much, and we'll be able to quote you the next time that particular row kicks off at home. In this first week, we're looking at one of the most fundamental, perhaps the most ancient of all investments.
This land is your land, and this land is my land.
This week, we are going to be looking at land, presumably the very first thing that was ever bought and sold, apart, of course, from sexual favours. And, of course, those VHS tapes you still see in charity shops. Tim, is this a fact, or am I deluded? Is land the earliest kind of traded item?
Well, I doubt it. I think it was more likely to be something like obsidian, which is a volcanic, glassy thing, good for making knives and slicing things up. If you're going to swap, say, meat for obsidian, we swap, you walk off with the obsidian, I walk off with the meat, fine, no problem. If you actually want to sell me land, how is it that you're going to say that you own this land? How are you going to you can't walk off with it. So if you've got an army, then you can defend the land, but then if you had an army, you wouldn't need to buy and sell it. So
what you're saying is you need essentially a legal infrastructure to protect your rights to the land before you can start trading in it?
Absolutely. It becomes really, really complicated. The obsidian's an awful lot simpler.
OK. Well, we'll try and fit in an episode on obsidian towards the end of the series. Now, For most people, an investment in land starts with buying their own home. And in this, they're not short of advice. Most of daytime television, for a start, is devoted to the ups and downs of buying your own home. Probably most famously, Channel 4's location, location, location. A mantra widely used to determine a good investment, and hence why the programme was such a hit, while BBC 4 show Chimneys, Chimneys, Chimneys was sadly axed after just one series. Which brings us on to the other great TV show on the subject, Property Ladder, wherein Sarah Beeny spent an hour trying to advise odious would-be property developers how to make money, and we spent an hour hoping to God they lost everything and ended up on the streets. The trouble, of course, was that Sarah Beeny's sage advice was in fact largely academic. During those boom years, you could have bought a house, boarded up the windows and spent the next 3 years in the pub and still reaped massive profits. You could scrawl, "I will kill again" on the lounge wall in red paint and still be beating them off with the proverbially fouled stick. Making money from property has always been more about cheap credit and upward trajectories than magnolia paint. It doesn't matter if you install a cheap power shower, a solid marble wet room, or a bucket on a tripod with some holes punched into the bottom with a nail. The market, like an unlicensed minicab driver, takes you whichever way it wants, regardless of what you do. And doesn't this just sum up our lack of engagement with the market? We trundle around IKEA on the lookout for the perfect patterned cushion while ignoring the macroeconomic trends that are really in charge. Property Ladder also promulgated another myth, namely that of the ladder itself, and the idea that getting your foot on the first rung is what owning property is all about. Because when you first hear about it, you imagine this so-called property ladder to be a nice, sturdy, stable ladder, the kind you might find propped up against a venerable old garden wall. In fact, once you're on this property ladder, you realise that it's often much more like one of those rope ladders that dangle out of a Sea King rescue helicopter in gale force winds. And that even if you do manage to grab hold of it, the only way to move up is to keep leaping from this ladder onto other ladders dangling from other helicopters and all piloted by gibbons. Don't lose heart. Land has always been a good investment in the long run. As Mark Twain said, or possibly somebody else off the internet, land is the thing to buy because folks will always want it and they ain't making it anymore. Twain's observation remains broadly true, and besides, for every new island created in Canary Wharf, another hotel slides off a cliff top in Scarborough, so it evens out in the end. The British have always instinctively understood the appeal of land, specifically of having a little place to call your own. In contrast, the French famously don't own their own homes, but instead rent apartments, mainly so that they can have affairs without subsequently losing them in the divorce. The difference between buying and renting, as any sexually exhausted Frenchman will tell you while lying supine on an adulterously tousled bed, is a philosophical distinction as much as anything. Renting recognises the human need to move on from time to time, to be free of ties, and indeed to lie on one's back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, smoking gitane, ignoring the wet patch and staring at a ceiling fan. Ownership, meanwhile, recognises the human need to be trapped, to lie on one's back at 2 in the morning, unable to ignore the wet patch in the ceiling as you calculate the cost of getting a new roof and hence how many years away your planned long weekend in Bruges is now. This is known as security. So those are your options. But even the French, who don't want to own their own home, still feel this primeval attachment to it, which is why they cling to the notion that they're any good at farming, unaware that it's only the protectionist legislation of the common agricultural policy that allows them to compete with countries served by better weather and harder working people. So, we all want land. The English want their pebble-dash semis, the French their so-called farms. The Americans, of course, yearn for the frontier, and the Russians are currently snapping up as much as they can get their hands on with scant regard for proper conveyancing or the exchange of contracts. Tim, this is a popular myth that the British are peculiarly obsessed with owning their own homes. Does it have a basis in reality?
It has a basis in reality. We used to own our homes more than Europeans, and now we don't anymore. And I think the reason is not because we don't want to, but because we can't afford to. We're not building anymore. So over the last 10 years or so, British home ownership has fallen to the European average. of about 2/3 of people live in their own homes.
I guess the fact that we did get obsessed with home ownership drove up the value of the real estate we live on, which you could argue is a good thing for the nation as a whole.
It's not necessarily a good thing. If you look at the countries in Europe that have very high rates of home ownership, they include Romania, Latvia. If you look at the countries that have very low rates, they include the Swiss, the Germans. They're doing all right. So maybe they figured something out.
This is a very English thing in itself. It's like the English idea that only we have what you could really call a sense of humour, and that Americans don't get irony, despite the fact that they made The Simpsons and we made Birds of a Feather. But there we are. Everyone, then, wants a bit of land. We can agree on that. And as an investment, land feels safe. You might invest in art. It could be reappraised as derivative and worthless. Fine wine can become corked, or more likely uncorked and drunk. If you own a home, you have at least got bricks and mortar. You've got roots. It is true. Buying land, buying property, it's not totally safe. It goes up as well as down, and they have to put that on the end of every advertisement. But the funny thing is, nearly everything else we buy is worth about 20% less than you paid for it by the time you get it home. Nobody ever says, caution, the value of your LED 52-inch television could go down as well as up, because the value of your TV is only ever going to go down, even if they do cancel BBC Three. Perhaps the main reason why property is a tempting proposition for the investor is down to something called leverage. And what is leverage? Let's ask Merryn Somerset-Webb. Can you explain leverage in as simple terms as possible?
Borrowing money.
Great, thank you, Merryn. And can I ask you, Tim, to explain leverage in slightly less simple terms? What is it specifically about borrowing money to buy a house that means it's called leverage, whereas if you borrow a tenner to go down to the pub, that word very rarely gets used?
So if you imagine buying a house, it's a £200,000 house. A year later, imagine the house has gone up by 10%. Well, you've made 10% on your investment of £200,000. If the house has gone down 10%, you've lost 10% on your investment. Now imagine you've got 20 grand, you put that down as a deposit, you've borrowed the rest from the bank. Now imagine the house goes up in value 10%. It's gone up in value £20,000, you put £20,000 into it, so you've doubled your money. And if the house falls in value 10%, you've lost all your money. So you've got this 10% move in the value of the house. If you buy it with a mortgage, with leverage, the impact on your investment is dramatically increased.
It is like a physical lever then, a lever being a screwdriver, isn't it? A lever which you place on a fulcrum, say the rim of a paint tin, and by pushing down and going through a long arc at the long end, the short end goes a short distance but can move a heavy... That's basically what you're doing, right?
Yes.
And the impact that has on the market itself, does it apply elsewhere? Why do we not get leverage to buy a car? Why do we not get leverage to buy a TV?
Well, you do get leverage to buy a car, you borrow money to buy a car, but you don't expect the car to go up in price, so you don't really think of it like that. There are other parts of the economy that use leverage, not always in a good way. So, for instance, the banks. And I don't know if you've noticed, Simon, but there was a bit of a problem with the banks a few years back. And one of the key problems was that banks were borrowing a lot of money and lending out a lot of money. They were very, very highly leveraged, to the extent that if a bank lost even 2 or 3% on its investments, it could be completely wiped out because of leverage.
So the difference between leverage and debt is essentially the prospect that what you've used to buy with your borrowed money might increase in value.
Yes, or fall in value. The property market is naturally leveraged, and then the moment the market falls, you get this painful thing called negative equity, which is just another way of saying that leverage has come back to bite you. If you imagine what the world would be like if nobody could get a mortgage, you can just look back 50 years, it was very difficult for anybody who wasn't very well established to get a mortgage. Most people had to rent. Houses were actually pretty cheap to buy, and so people would buy up houses, rent them out for a huge profit. So in many ways, the accessibility of mortgages, it's created a lot of risk in the housing market, but it has democratised the housing market as well.
More democratic. But without mortgages, houses would cost roughly what they cost to build, much as they do in Sunderland, for instance. Don't worry, they won't be listening. It's okay. it has a moral dimension, doesn't it? I think property ownership, and certainly people who buy property in order to invest, as it were, there is a disdain for it. It certainly, I think it has a political dimension. It's something to do possibly with the morally dubious way most people first got hold of property. There's an old saying on the left from a French anarchist called Proudhon, who said property is theft, by which he meant that the initial stake in any property must have been seized without any kind of commercial transaction having taken place. I'm not just talking about Foxtons. I'm talking, for instance, a bit further back to even marginally aggressively less acquisitive people such as the Spanish conquistadors who wiped out the Incas. But for most of prehistory, for most of ancient history, land was held in common. God did not apportion any of it out to named individuals and tribes, despite what Zionists and Yorkshiremen would have you believe. So it follows that ownership therefore began when land was at some point arbitrarily seized, such as during the colonization of the New World. When Europeans arrived in America, they found an indigenous people living on it, and these Native Americans had been living on the land for centuries, but they'd never really discovered it. And initially, the Native Americans were sceptical about the whole concept of land ownership. Even today, it is fair to say they have their reservations. So, I'm allowed one of those per series, OK? I'd like to talk now to somebody who knows a little bit more about this than even me or Tim put together. He's written a book called Who Owns Britain? Please welcome to the stage Kevin Cahill. Hello, Kevin. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming along to join us. Can I ask you initially, I mean, the obvious question to begin with is the one suggested by your own book. Who does own Britain?
Mrs. Windsor and her son, Charles.
Right. That's not Barbara you're talking about. OK, that's...
There goes your MBE.
Yeah. I mean, that's almost like a childlike view of the country, isn't it? That the Queen actually owns Britain. But you would say that's legally the case?
It's legally the case. The whole system in the country is based on the fact that she owns the land. You own the bricks, perhaps, but the Crown owns all land. And the Crown and Prince Charles, sorry, I want to be accurate here.
And what does Prince Charles own?
He owns Cornwall.
And that's where he makes his biscuits?
Something like that.
OK. But the Queen owns all the rest. Where does that title come from, then? Is that from time immemorial?
No, William the Conqueror, alias William the Bastard. That's what the French call him, and he was one of theirs.
Oh, right.
We really got the short end of the stick when he turned up here.
So he established ownership of the country?
Yeah, he enforced it.
And is this to do with the Doomsday Book?
No, that was his tax list.
OK.
And it was mostly the big landowners. But no, there was a prior history of the Crown owning land. The Roman emperors claimed to own all land, so there was a precedent before he got here.
Now, a lot of people will hear this and will think, well, it's all very well and good, but it's a kind of an academic distinction. We all know that we buy and sell our houses without the Queen getting involved. It would crop up in the papers if she ever put her oar in. Does it actually have an impact in some low rumbling frequency that we're not aware of, but that is actually distorting the land market in the UK?
No, it's only in an emergency that it becomes clear. During the last war, the Ministry of Defence occupied 11 million acres of Britain. That's a sixth of the two islands. And they didn't pay rent because they did it for the Crown who owned the land.
Right. And the people who had previously been occupying that land were just shunted to one side?
They were given dilapidation and they were given new fences and things like that, but they weren't paid rent.
So another big question, is land scarce in the United Kingdom? You know, one side of the political divide will certainly say things like, we're full, and the other side will say no.
No, land isn't scarce in the United Kingdom. All of us live on less than 10% of the two islands.
Less than 10% of the land is covered?
Is occupied by bricks and mortar and people.
That's extraordinary.
That's 90% isn't.
That 90% is just fields and mountains and rivers and lakes and whatever.
Fly over it.
Yeah.
It's full of fields and cows and things.
So, putting aside the necessity of farming some of it, you know, in order to provide food, are you saying it is unnaturally distorted in that respect? Are we maintaining the countryside out of some sentimental attachment to that ratio?
No, the people who argue for protecting the countryside are mostly landowners who are protecting their interest in high land prices.
Is there any prospect of that being overturned or changed?
Well, the simple prospect is inform the public. Tell people how much land there actually is and tell them not to listen. to these people who say, 35 years from now, England will be covered with bricks and mortar.
Are we not, though, quite a densely populated country by European standards, aren't we?
No, the places we live in are densely populated, but there's an enormous amount of empty space out there. A very high percentage of farmland is not properly used at all. A lot of people get money for not putting cows in the fields and not growing anything in them. The whole system is crazy.
Do you invest in land yourself, or do you take purely an academic interest?
Not formally. We have our house so we can live in it. I know that sounds bizarre, but the investment I'd advise is your own home.
Thank you very much. Kevin Cahill, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I'm aware that this segment might have turned a lot of you into anarchists and lost you from Radio 4 listening figures forever. If that's the case, I'll bid you farewell and only ask that you don't upturn too many bins near my house as it plays havoc with the seagulls. But for the rest of the heartless robots still with me who see the potential of riding a leveraged screwdriver to untold riches, it's time to get down to the nitty-gritty of property speculation. Before we do, there is one golden rule I've learned the hard way. Do bear in mind that owning your own home is the only example of investment which you yourself can royally balls up with your stupid DIY improvements. If you buy shares in a company, it's very unlikely they'll give you a go at running it for a week and come back to find you've broken all the oil rigs or flooded Canary Wharf trying to turn it into a wet room. So it may be best to separate your house from your investment. To that end, apart from residential properties, as we've discussed, there are two main other ways in. Commercial property, which is best if you want to drive around it on a forklift truck, or farmland, which is great if your main objective is to shout at people to get off it. What do we need to remember when getting our investment hands dirty? Let's ask Tim. Apparently, farmland has increased in value on average by 20% every year for the last decade, which is an extraordinarily good return. And yet, actually getting income from farms has fallen. Is there some hidden angle? Is there some racket going on with farming?
I don't think there's a racket, but I mean, there are tax breaks. People see something increasing in value. The newspapers start writing about it. You say, maybe I should invest in a farmland fund. Maybe I should buy a farm. And so,
are you saying it's a bubble?
It looks like speculation. No one ever knows. But yeah, it's a bit weird that you can't make any money owning a farm, and yet people are willing to pay more and more for farms. Yeah. And it's not as if they're suddenly handing out planning permission freely. Economists call this financialisation, really. The way the economy has been taken over more by financial services and by banking, and so more and more people are investing in things that they don't really know what it is.
Yeah.
We're basically getting involved where we have no idea what we're doing.
Yeah, it's all become quite abstract. Buy-to-let. Let's have a look at buy-to-let. Tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me the key here is not to buy anything that anyone in their right mind would want to own. If you buy something that anyone else would want to live in, you'll be up against people who do want to own it, and then the price will go up. Whereas what you want is something that people would only consider living in if they can convince themselves that they're just going through an unfortunate phase, possibly transitional, and therefore they're renting. And then you're only likely to be competing against other profiteering lizards like yourself. Buy-to-let is fairly straightforward. It seems so, at least. But are there hidden snags? Merryn.
It's definitely not as much of a cert now today as it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, because we've just come out of a 30-year cycle of falling interest rates. And interest rates have now fallen to really the lowest they can possibly go. They're at their lowest in 300 years. The only way from here is up. And house prices tend to move inversely to interest rates.
Because the price of a house is really the price of the mortgage that you will buy it with.
Exactly. Demand for housing is all about the price of credit.
So the idea that bricks and mortar is just bricks and mortar is a delusion.
The reason why everyone loves buy-to-let is because they feel they know where they are with bricks and mortar. You know, they can touch it, they can feel it, they can see it. They think they understand it. But of course, the really interesting thing is that you don't really understand bricks and mortar unless you understand global interest rates. You know, if you can predict where interest rates in the UK are going to go over the next 10 years, then sure, you understand bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
If you can't, and I certainly can't, I'm pretty sure, just a guess, Simon, but I'm guessing you can't either, then you don't understand bricks and mortar.
And yet you kid yourself you do, because you think, it's all just about whether that front door needs a new lick of paint or not.
Exactly.
So, as long as we're talking about potential pitfalls, it's probably time to talk about the elephant in the room, the thing which seems to scare most people when it comes to investing, and that is the bubble. Spotting housing bubbles before they pop is one of the great mythical skills. It's up there with alchemy and prophecy and getting your printer to successfully scan and print a document. So, Tim, do you have any tips?
I mean, there are a couple of ways of thinking about bubbles. A bubble is when any asset price gets divorced from the fundamental value. A property is delivering you rental returns. A bond or a share is paying dividends or paying interest. Now, if the price of that asset is nothing to do with the financial returns that you're receiving, and the only reason to buy that asset is because you think it's going to keep going up in price even more, that's a fairly good working definition of a bubble. Now, there is another definition which was put about by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Shiller. He said you need to think of it more as a psychiatric disorder. Is everybody talking about rising prices? Do people tell themselves that this time is different? Do you have this conversation everywhere you go? And if you can tick a few things off on your psychiatric checklist, then, yeah, it's a bubble.
There's a very famous story about the stock market. They didn't use the word bubble, of course, but in 1929, a wealthy investor sat down one day on Wall Street to get his shoes shined, and the shoe shine boy started giving him stock tips. And suddenly a little light bulb went on over his head, and he thought to himself, when the shoe shine boy is getting involved in the stock market, that means everyone's in. It's reached the pitch of hysteria. There's no new money to enter this market. It's reached its peak, and he walked in apparently and sold everything and escaped scot-free about 2 weeks before the crash came. And that story is most often told, funnily enough, about Joseph Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy's father. So it just goes to show, you don't use all your luck up in one go, but it's also a question of scale. You could argue that the entire Earth, viewed from an adequate distance and over an adequate timescale, is just one big housing bubble. Things go and rise and fall all the time. I think the word bubble is deceptive. I think of them as being a bit more like waves that terrify a novice surfer but stiffen an export board shorts with excitement. They lift you up to heights that the laws of nature suggest you shouldn't be able to reach. They propel you forward with a momentum that is exhilarating. And if you're lucky enough to be borne along on one and get off at the right moment, it's utterly exciting. It's all you can talk about afterwards, which is why surfers have their own bars near beaches and people in Wandsworth have their own bars where they can talk about house prices. I think it's a mistake to be completely pessimistic about the future of the bubble. All best things happen in a bubble. What is falling in love but a bubble? A period of unfettered optimism where grand, unrealistic plans are laid that eventually, yes, collapse under the weight of despair into great loss. Clinton still haven't got back to me about that as a Valentine's card message, but what have we learned this evening? Well, the best way to get your hands on some land is to get some leverage, then use it to buy a Russian tank and annex whatever takes your fancy. Sell your house and invest it all in obsidian. But seriously, run for your lives. Do not get involved in land at any level whatsoever. It's utterly unpredictable. Interest rates will go up. Values will plummet. You will be utterly ruined. But in the long term, you should be fine. Thank you very much for listening. I've been Simon Evans. Thank you and good night. You've been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market, where I, Simon Evans, was joined by Tim Harford, Merryn Somerset-Webb and Kevin Cahill. It was written by me, Simon Evans, with Benjamin Partridge, Guy Venables and Andy Walton, and the producer is Talusha Galani. Good evening and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. It says a lot about our culture that Adrian Chiles began his career as a serious financial broadcaster and was so good at it that he was then promoted to doing the football. Movements of money around the world are at least equally exciting and a damn sight more important to your quality of life. It's pretty much the only way to understand the football too, for that matter. When you go to watch, say, Manchester City versus Chelsea, you're really watching oil money versus gas. It certainly makes more sense thought of that way than it does with any spurious reference to their supposed geographical bases. Come on, the gas! My point is, it's worth paying attention to the markets because if you understand money, a lot of other things suddenly start to make sense too. Unlike many high earners, Premiership footballers included, Money doesn't lie. It may get things wrong, but it doesn't lie. It's extraordinary how many of us will listen to politicians on the news explain what they plan to do about this or hope to see happen to that, but then switch off when the discussion turns to the markets. It's a bit like watching a pre-match press conference and then not watching the game itself. I mean, that's what I do, but then I don't like football. I only watch the press conference because I find grown men wearing tracksuits indoors inherently amusing. Get involved, as the floating head of Ray Winston might say. Why not invest? Maybe you think it will cost you your soul. Poets would have you believe that the square mile is peopled entirely by cynics who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. The City, on the other hand, will tell you that there are currently no more than 8 poets in the whole of the United Kingdom whose endeavours in the medium have moved them into even the lowest band of income tax. Don't worry, I have it on good authority that Roger McGough lives like a playboy. Gets 3 hot meals a day. Now, last week we looked at land and property, one of the most ancient expressions of wealth and still perhaps the one that occupies the lion's share of our attention as a nation. This week we are going to be looking at the stuff that can be grown on that land if push comes to shove and you can't get planning permission to build a miserable red brick housing development on it. Grain. Many say that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, though for me it isn't even in the top 5. But whatever your personal favourite, dinner, supper or tea, all the same meal in different parts of the country, if you time it right, Food in today's world is a very politicised and industrialised proposition, and increasingly it's one affected fundamentally and not always benevolently by the markets, specifically the commodities markets. Now, just as most Premier League managers need a translator, especially the Scottish ones, so I need someone to translate the language of the markets, and here to help me with that is author and presenter of BBC Radio 4's More or Less, a man whose CV begs the question, if he's that good at economics, why isn't he rich? It's Tim Harford. Tim, let me ask you before we get into the nitty-gritty of this evening's subject, as an economist, do you have any theories as to why the insanely rich in the world nowadays seem so intent on owning Premiership football clubs instead of yachts?
Well, as well as yachts, I think you mean.
As well as yachts.
You know, I do have a theory, actually. My theory is that everything you need to know about football can be explained by 5 factors: globalisation, technology, oil prices, cheap credit and vanity.
Vanity? How would vanity fit in?
Well, vanity is why you would spend enormous amounts of money on, say, Manchester City when Liverpool are going to win the league.
We'll see. And here, to help me understand commodities, we have on the line, not from Somerset and not from a Webb either, but hopefully slightly merry, Editor-in-Chief of Money Week, Merryn Somerset-Webb. Merryn, I apologise for that homeopathically weak pun on your name. Could you please forgive us and get us started by telling us what is meant by the word commodities?
A commodity, for the purposes of investment, is something which can be freely traded between people that is identical at every level. So a piece of art is not a commodity. You can buy and sell it, but each piece of art is unique. In the main, a potato is a potato. A grain of rice is a grain of rice. A grain of wheat is a grain of wheat. You know that 1 kilo is always the same as another kilo.
Something is more like a commodity, the less likely it is to appear on the humorous fruit section of That's Life. We then go on to discuss the fact that commodities, rather like boiled eggs and porn, come in 2 varieties, hard and soft.
You can roughly divide commodities into hard commodities,
right?
So metals, energy, etc., and soft commodities,
food,
wood.
You just have a gut feeling, and all traders understand in the gut whether they're dealing with...
whether it's soft or hard.
Stop saying that. Very much like porn, commodity trading is a much bigger industry than most people realise, and largely consists of men hunched over their computer screens with their hearts racing as they exploit the hard work of poorly paid people with superior physiques. Now, if you want to buy commodities, you can, of course, just go and buy some commodities. But that would be far too simple for the markets, wouldn't it? They need to jazz things up a bit in order to start making money. And you're going to love what they came up with. Merryn, can you please explain futures?
Well, futures are, in theory, very, very simple. And they originated from the idea of a farmer wanting to lock in a price for his produce at the beginning of a season. So he calls somebody and says, I want to sell it now. What will you give me for the stuff that I'm going to produce in August? He gets a price, and then he knows what he's going to get at the end of the season. So that's a futures contract.
I'm a stand-up comedian as well as, an economics expert. And if I agree to do somebody's Christmas party, now, we'll set a price. I agree to do it at that price in December. That's a futures contract,
That is
essentially.
exactly right. You have made a contract to deliver a particular product, and in this case, you at a Christmas party, for a set price at a set point in the future.
I'm not at all sure. I like the way she laughed at Christmas party there. I think she suspects me of being a strippogram. Anyway. One last thing from Merryn. Futures contracts are a relatively simple example of what is a rather complex and intimidating concept in trading, the derivative. So, finally, from Merryn, an explanation of derivatives.
A derivative is simply a financial instrument that derives its value from some kind of underlying commodity, although it doesn't have to be a commodity. It can be anything, the value of which has already been set at some point in the future, that has a time value attached to it. But on top of that, there's all sorts of other things that could change the value before the final day comes.
Right. That's another example of the way in which finance and comedy is different, because in comedy, derivative means it reminds you of Stuart Lee a bit. Tim, does this mean, to pursue, for instance, the comedy equivalent, the analogy, is it as if my value remarkably goes up over the next 6 months, having made that contract, somebody else might buy that contract off the person with the Christmas party, and now I have to do their Christmas party instead? Is it like that?
It is a little bit like that. So if you think about a unique comic genius such as yourself, Simon, that's really you've really struck a forward contract, and that's really a private deal. That's not standardised. That's not going to be traded. You've agreed you'll perform at the Christmas party for a particular price.
Right.
But if I were to go to the producer of this show, Talusha Galani, and say, well, Talusha, you've got comedians by the dozen. They're all the same, basically. I just want an hour of comedy, really, at my Christmas party, and I could sign a futures contract with Talusha to just provide an hour of some comic or other. Well, that's now a sort of standardised product, an hour of comedy to be delivered. Then at that point, someone might say, well, actually, the price of comedy is rising. I want to buy your hour of comedy, and it could be traded. And then, of course, you have smart guys in the city who start just making bets with each other about what the price of an hour of comedy will be. And those are derivatives contracts. They've actually got nothing to do with getting a comedian to show up at your Christmas party. It's just a bet to make money.
So, to take it back to the genuine commodities markets, if they forget that they have made this bet, or if they get drunk, or they get an annoying phone call about their daughter being in jail again or something, and it clears their mind,
and the doorbell rings, and there you are, standing there, saying, "Here I am to perform," and they. So,
but it's happened to me. You laugh.
Did they? I wonder.
And vice versa, for that matter. Do you have any idea what sort of proportion of contracts that are traded of this kind actually result in people taking delivery of some product?
I've seen one claim that about 3% involve physical delivery and 97% are basically settled with cash.
97% of it is white boys betting. OK, well, listen, I think we've got the idea. We can at least agree that you're basically gambling on what you think the price will be at some future date. Clearly, commodity trading is a very big subject to cover in half an hour. Coffee alone is worth over $100 billion per annum worldwide, although some say you are really paying for the Wi-Fi. So, this week we're going to focus on grain, corn, wheat, rice, and their trendier, healthier ilk, such as quinoa and silica gel. I'm just kidding. Don't eat silica gel, although it does reduce water retention. And as we've heard, in the way of these things, futures in grains were initially devised with the best of possible motives to protect farmers from the vagaries of climate and nature, crop circle enthusiasts, vermin, and a whole world of pests known by farmers as the axis of weevils. Oh, yeah. But now, as is the way of these things, they've become just another tradable derivative exchanged on the world's electronic dashboards by flashy men in braces who have no interest in taking possession. I do rather feel there could be an opportunity for a Disney family movie here. a hard-bitten commodity trader who has no time for love or family forgets to close out on a deal one day and finds himself taking delivery of 50,000 bushels of grain. He wakes up to find them piled outside his desirable and immaculate apartment. At first, he resists this change in his lifestyle, but gradually the corn wins him over. The corn teaches him important lessons about life, love, and maintaining correct ambient temperature. Eventually, the time comes for the corn to move on to a feedlot. But by then, change has been wrought. There is a female actress as well, probably a scientist or like a vet, but for grain. Basically, this is Turner and Hooch. In fact, given that hooch is slang for whiskey, which is made from grain, I think this is a very natural sequel. Anyway, grains have long been one of the more readily traded commodities because they are wonderfully uniform. Indeed, barleycorns are so uniform that they were themselves, once upon a time, a unit of measurement. In the imperial system, so named because it rules, the inch... It does. The inch is defined as 3 barleycorns, with a mile being... No one? 190,080 barleycorns. Even in the olden days, they were rarely stored end to end because that would be just too weird of a barn. And just in case you think they are archaic, barleycorns are even now the increments in which adult shoe sizes increase in the UK. Yeah, didn't know that, did you? Thus allowing us to tell naughty adolescents to act their age, not their shoe size, which doesn't work in France, where their shoe size is probably 42.
Simon, you were saying that there are 190,080 barleycorns to the mile, and that...
I worked that out on a calculator.
Yeah, no, that is true if you're talking about a statute mile, but for a Roman mile, interestingly, there are 174,960.
Wow. Corn, wheat and rice supply more than 50% of all humanity's calories, as any restaurant goer will tell you, having gorged themselves on complimentary bread and left no room for their lamb shanks. Tim, can you give us any interesting facts and figures on grain consumption?
Well, as you know, Simon, interesting facts and figures are my thing. There's a lot of talk that we're basically feeding all of the grain to animals and hardly eating any of it ourselves. In the United States, according to the numbers I've got, 78% of cereals are fed to livestock, so more than 3/4. In Western Europe, it's less, it's about 2/3, and in the world as a whole, it's only 38%. So this is very much a sort of developed world phenomenon where we're feeding these cereals to cows and, you know, sheepies and other... I'm not really an expert on the animals.
It was Dr. Johnson, I think, wasn't it, who said in his dictionary the definition of oats was that it was a food for horses and in Scotland for people. I mean, it's a terribly wasteful way of consuming calories, presumably, that we grow grain and then feed it to cattle. That's a luxury.
Yeah, although steak is really nice, so...
It's not a natural food for animals either, is it? I mean, corn on the cob, what we call maize, which they call corn in America, which is what they feed to the animals, they don't... It's not... Cows wouldn't eat that in the wild, would they? Cows in the wild, I don't know if you've ever seen... Cows in the wild, they prefer a nice bit of grass, as I've seen them. There might be wild cows, a few of them.
I'm sure you're right, yes, whatever you say.
Furthermore, food is fundamental not just to our own health, but to the political health of the nation. Food is what we really care about, and if it goes missing or gets too expensive, we do notice fast. Tim, have you got any information about food riots in this country? I suspect we have been subject to them.
We have. We like different causes of riots in the UK. I mean, the poll tax riots and... Oh, in 1809, there was a riot, the Old Price riot, because the price of theatre tickets in Covent Garden had gone up. So, but there have been food riots. So in 1766, there were the bread and butter riots across England. And my favourite food riot, 1743, the London gin riot. Now, that is a food riot.
Now, the reliable supply of food is crucial to political stability. Any head of government that doesn't wish to end up on a pike will ensure that supply remains available, whatever the price, which is what makes grain so interesting to the casual investor. But does it make it a safe bet? And does it make it a moral bet? Or is it morally contaminated? Earlier this week, I spoke to one of the world's leading investors in commodities, a man by the name of Jim Rogers, who has made many, many millions of dollars investing in food worldwide. And I asked him if the market can be trusted to create the price necessary to encourage farmers to farm.
Oh, absolutely. If you didn't have centralized markets, you would have chaos, as we've had before in history. Politicians and journalists always like to blame problems on evil speculators. You need investors, you need central markets, or you're not going to know what prices are. And a lot of people are going to get taken advantage of because they don't know the real price. If the price of bread's going up, it's because there's shortages somewhere. Because if there weren't shortages, the people with the wheat would dump it on the heads of the speculators.
Now, I know what you're thinking, but believe me, he knows what he's talking about, OK? That is your prejudice against a certain kind of accent. But still, I want to know, if the market is working so well, how do we find ourselves in this current predicament?
Over the last 10 years or so, the world has consumed more than it has produced. Now, when you consume more than you produce, the supply has to come from somewhere. So we've been whittling down our inventories, our stocks, so that now inventories of agricultural products are near historic lows.
So if that's the case, Jim, why don't the farmers just grow more grain?
Agriculture has been such a horrible business for 30 years that we're now running out of farmers. Nobody wants to be a farmer. In America, the average age of farmers is 58. In Japan, it's 66. In Canada, it's the oldest in recorded history. In Australia, it's 58. Nobody wants to be a farmer. In America, Simon, more people study public relations than study agriculture.
So maybe the thing to do is become a farmer.
Simon, in the next decade or two, it's going to be the farmers who are driving the Lamborghinis. The stockbrokers are going to be driving taxis. The smart ones will learn how to drive tractors so they can work for the rich farmers. But I'm not doing that because I wouldn't be any good as a farmer. I'd go bankrupt.
We'll accept that that's Jim's reason for not becoming a farmer, and not because he's well into his 70s and worth over $1 billion. But so, Tim, what do you think about the ethics of speculating on people's food?
I think there's no problem with it as long as the speculators know what they're doing. I mean, if you think about a speculator who's actually making money, he would be buying grain when it's cheap, and he would be selling grain when it's expensive. Otherwise, he's losing money. And if he's buying grain when it's cheap, he's slightly raising the price of grain. And if he's selling grain when it's expensive, he looks like he's profiteering, and he is profiteering, but he's also slightly pulling down the price of grain when you really need to pull down the price of grain. So he's actually smoothing out the peaks and the troughs in the price of grain, and he's making money for himself into the bargain.
So speculating on grain is only evil if it's cack-handed.
Yeah. Which, admittedly, given recent experience, is quite likely.
Farming began during what is now called the Neolithic or New Stone Age, although back then it was known simply as now. And for the first few thousand years, farmers enjoyed autonomy in spades. Literally, they could stick their spades wherever they wanted. However, there were very few other upsides to farming even then. It would have been back-breaking work with no guarantee of a good harvest. There wasn't even bread to look forward to for the first few thousand years, just a sort of oaty mash, such as an independent Scotland might consider its national dish. Gradually, as farming became more large-scale, fewer participants were required per acre of land, allowing society to turn their attention to inventing the wheel, or money, or writing smart-ass scripts for the 6:30 campfire comedy slot, just before the 7 o'clock sacrifice to the gods of agriculture began. And over the next few thousand years, farming became ever more sophisticated. Nevertheless, we cherish in this country a rather quaint vision of how we like to think agriculture is conducted. My children, for instance, are taken on a regular basis to farms all over East Sussex, where they are encouraged to enjoy an educational and fun day out. Farms, as they understand it, consist of a large car park full of Range Rovers that have never seen so much as a rutted track. They cost £8 each to get in. They've got 2 lambs, a llama for some reason. tractor rides at 15 quid a throw, and some vast gift shop full of hand-wank cider and artisan marmalade. And this, they fondly imagine, is the state of farming today. I would like to take them one day to something a bit more realistic, to some vast industrial turkey shed on the outskirts of a housing estate full of hobbling abominations of poultry trying in vain to lift its hormone-inflated bulk out of the stench of its own effluent long enough to peck its neighbour blindly on the cheek with the remains of its beak. That would be an educational day out. I'd like to see the gift shop. I suppose that's Tesco, isn't it? I don't know. My point is, farming is now more industrial than industry. When we hear the term big pharma now, it is usually short for pharmaceutical industry, rather than a huge man in a check shirt shouting at you to get off his land. But in reality, farming is every bit as big and politically powerful as the drugs companies. Big Pharma could do worse than follow suit. What could be more pleasant on a Sunday morning than to stroll among the stalls picking out some hand-foraged painkillers, some balsamic anticoagulants and a punnet of sun-dried strepsils at the Big Pharma market, without having to go through that pesky NHS middleman? To understand where we're at now with farmed goods, what is worth investing in, what the world really eats and why, and whether it's OK to gamble on people's breakfast, please welcome to the stage Dean of the School of Business and Entrepreneurship at the Royal Agricultural University, Kanis Raja. So, Kanis, let's start with Jim's startling observation that the wheel of fortune is about to turn in favour of the farmers, and that they will shortly all be driving around in Lamborghinis.
I'm not so sure that's going to happen imminently. I think they first have to start learning how to take risk and to deal with this wonderful word, volatility.
City types are now gambling on the price of food. Are those affecting the food market malevolently, or are they in fact a force for good?
I think speculation is always harmful. The farmer is not really that sophisticated, and certainly not in this country. We don't spend enough time, farmers don't, selling their produce. We spend, I think, typically about 5% of our time.
Just to be clear, you're not talking about the farmer's market here. You're talking about... It is conceivable that somebody might actually be trying to take something useful away from this show. Is it... But seriously, if somebody were to try and invest in the commodities market, in soft commodities, we're looking at grains this evening, corn, wheat, rice. Are there distinctions between those markets, and what should they be aware of?
Well, it's a very interesting combination you just offered, because we look at rice. Rice is huge in production worldwide, but it does very little to pricing, because most of the rice is consumed within the markets they're grown in. On the other hand, if you take wheat, we have global output, something like 750 million tons. About 130 million tons is traded. The third one, corn. Now, that is huge. Corn is not only used as feed, but also for energy. A lot of it is converted to ethanol. Now, once you get into ethanol, an energy market, you're invariably tipping into shale oil and gas. Now, if we are extracting more shale oil and gas, the price of ethanol will come down because it's cheaper to extract shale and oil and gas than to keep ethanol going. Much more of the corn will be released back into the feed market, which means it'll depress the price of wheat and barley.
So what you're saying is if we should let fracking go ahead because it will reduce the price of a loaf of bread. Good. You heard it here first, Evan. Corn is interesting, and I have done some reading on this, and to be honest, it's slightly terrifying. There's a nutritionist and author, and very well-respected authority by the name of Michael Pollan, and he's written some books about the huge area of agricultural activity where they simply grow corn and then mutate it after the event into whatever product they want. Corn is grown as a feed for cattle, of course. It's grown and eaten on the cob, but it's also turned into something called high-fructose corn syrup, which is used to make all their soft drinks, the construction of McDonald's fries. He actually did a genuine experiment with a mass spectrometer, which they used to analyse the flesh of the average American. And apparently there's something about the carbon atoms in corn that you can follow it through its various incarnations as it passes through you, or indeed into a cow, which you then eat, and so on. And the findings were that basically Americans are now largely corn. They are corny. They are, but they really are. They are literally children of the corn. Corn is now like triffids. The fact that it can't physically uproot itself and walk about is inconsequential when you look at the support it has in Congress on its behalf. Agricultural policy in America no longer seems to be for the benefit of the farmer, certainly, or the consumer. It is essentially for the benefit of the corn itself. It's a terrifying scenario. Would you recommend buying futures in grains? Would you recommend buying shares in tractor firms? How would you put your money?
Well, there's no question. You'll be wise to invest in food. All the figures point out annual growth in world population. We are losing land mass. We are having climatic condition changes, and so on. So when we come back to the whole area of agri-industry, it's the $4.5 trillion industry. It is exactly what the farmer says. It's a way of life, but it's really the whole of society embodied within this industry.
Thank you very much. Kanes Raja, ladies and gentlemen. So, Tim, you've heard what we've had to say this evening. It looks like investing in food and farming is a pretty valid notion. What would you say would be the quickest route to fortune?
It's pretty simple. Sell a lock-up in Walthamstow and use the proceeds to buy East Anglia.
So, what have we learned? Only 3% of grain trading involves actual delivery of grain, though that may improve now they've privatised Royal Mail. 78% of cereals in North America are fed to animals, although I suspect most of that is to Tony the Tiger. And in the future, the real money will be in farming, which means the Archers is going to be a lot more like Dallas. Hopefully it'll turn out that Nigel Pargeter didn't die and it was all a dream. Can't wait for the Jill Archer sex romp. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good night. You've been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market with me, Simon Evans, Tim Harford, Merryn Somerset-Webb, Jim Rogers and Kanes Raja. It was written by Simon Evans with Benjamin Partridge and Andy Walton, and the producer is Talusha Galani. Welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. This series is all about the grown-up stuff in the newspaper that comes between you zoning out during the letters page and coming to again as you enter the world of sport. The business news, the half-dozen pages in the middle of every newspaper whose headlines seem to be written in morphine. Sleep, they seem to say. Sleep. It's like the core of the news apple. You know it's important, but it doesn't taste nice and it ends up in the bin, even though it's actually the one bit that something useful might come out of, like another apple. Well, wake up. And before you start spinning the dial looking for something less taxing, it's quite simple. Don't you want to be rich? Of course you do. Don't you at least want to be able to dismiss wealth as a possible route to happiness from first-hand experience? And even if money is, as many people in business say, really just a way of keeping score, doesn't that sound like the kind of healthy, irreverent disregard for the stuff that you would quite like to cultivate, rather than thinking, yes, get in, every time you find an unexpected fiver that has survived a wash in the coin pocket of your smart jeans? There is only one way for most of us to get rich, and it isn't through hard work, marrying well, or releasing your own fragrance. I released my own fragrance earlier today, and all it earned for me were a few dirty looks from my fellow passengers. The secret is through piggybacking on other people's hard work. This is known as investing, and it is an important life skill. And it's not just about greed. Becoming economically literate is a great way to understand the world and the forces that really shape it. Otherwise, you end up thinking that your present difficulties are a sign that God is angry, like a medieval farmer or an American. If you want to know whether they're likely to, for instance, build a third runway in the Thames estuary, you could listen to Boris Johnson yakking on about it, but you'll learn a lot more from taking a quick look at what's happening to shares in BAA, Essex land prices, and futures in massive Toblerone bars. Of course, it cannot be overstated just how ill-equipped I am personally to discuss any of this. beyond a certain way of speaking at any rate. I do have two of the country's foremost economists to help me, however. The presenter of Radio 4's More or Less, Financial Times columnist, Tim Harford. Tim, for someone who clearly does understand all this stuff, quick question. Why aren't you rich?
I should be richer, shouldn't I? I think the main place I went wrong is not writing Freakonomics. That would really have helped.
Have you actually ever wondered whether you would be better off just like sitting in front of a screen all day trading furiously?
Well, I once interviewed the economics and business writer Michael Lewis. He wrote Moneyball, very, very, very successful economics writer. And I said, well, I guess it worked out for you because he sold millions of books. And he shook his head. He said, oh, no. I would have been far, far richer being a mediocre investment banker than the most successful economics writer in the world. So you've got to pick your right profession.
Thank you, Tim. And tonight, a woman whose name certainly makes her sound rich, Editor-in-Chief of Money Week, Merryn Somerset-Webb, is on the line from Edinburgh. Merryn, why are people resistant to the idea of investing?
Yes, everything about money is actually remarkably simple, but we have come to believe that it's very, very difficult and therefore it's expensive and that we can't anticipate what the result will be. Now, if a financial advisor came along to you and said, you know what, investing is really incredibly easy, you can do it by yourself in 10 minutes, you don't need me, it wouldn't really do them any good.
So, in other words, people aren't investing because they're intimidated by deliberately malevolent investment professionals. Let's see if we can put that right. This week, we're going to look at perhaps the most iconic but arguably most ridiculous embodiment of wealth still in play. Yes, gold. Of all the materials currently traded on the world's markets, this bright, chemically inert metal is paradoxically perhaps the darkest, the most corrupting, the most mysterious. Cherished by mankind since the dawn of history, beloved of inbred Egyptian despots, English pirates, and Swiss bankers with a dubious notion of neutrality. Gold has always dominated our febrile delusions of grandeur and led us astray more often than an Amstrad own-brand sat-nav. The power of gold has transcended the ages, as has nothing else. Gold is special. Don't take my word for it. Here again is Merryn.
Gold is special.
See? When pressed to say why, I'm not sure even Merryn can quite put her finger on it.
Look around at everything else. Is there anything else that people can trade easily between themselves that's rare, that has a finite supply, that is almost impossible to destroy? You know, you can recover gold from any accident any time. It doesn't go away. And that you can make into anything, and that you can make into small, valuable blocks and store, but also into tiny little bits that you can sew into the hem of your skirt. There isn't anything else that is quite like gold.
Tim, why has this basically useless, if delightfully shiny metal become so highly valued by humans? Why is gold special?
Well, there are lots of things that would make good money. So back in the day, people would use salt to denominate contract. If you were going to borrow money or you were going to pay a salary, you could pay it in salt.
Table salt?
Which is why we get the word salary. It's based on the Roman word for salt. And that's because salt was very, very stable in value. You only needed a bit of it, had a stable way of producing it, so that's a good thing for money. But salt doesn't make a very good coin. You start to go through the elements, and you think about the alternatives to gold. So hydrogen blows up, helium floats away, sodium is very
also,
reactive.
helium makes you speak funny, which would probably ruin the contract you were about to seal with
So sodium keeps turning into other stuff. Lead's too common, mercury's too runny and it's poisonous, uranium gives you cancer, even iron will rust. You've only got a few very precious metals. Platinum's too rare, you'd have tiny, tiny, tiny coins. So you've only got gold and silver left. That's one of the reasons why gold has started to absorb our attention.
All right, historically, I can see that, but that's in an era before ultraviolet pens and banknotes and those three little numbers on the back of your credit card that so entirely wipe out the opportunity for fraud. Why, 4,000 years on from that era, does gold still hold such a tight grip on our imagination and of the world's banks and governments and, serious players?
Well, I'll be tempted to say that gold's in a bubble. It's just been a bubble that's lasted, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years. That people are still interested in gold because they know that other people are interested in gold. That is the fundamental thing. I mean, sure, there are some industrial uses. You can use it for jewellery. There's a lot of demand in India because it's a portable way of carrying around wealth as jewellery. But mostly, the reason people want gold is because they believe that other people will also want gold. And that's just a dynamic that's continued for thousands of years.
It's something of an enigma, isn't it? Let's see if we can break it down. Gold is now worth $1,350 an ounce, give or take, which is not quite as expensive as it sounds, since gold is measured in troy ounces. Troy ounce is an ancient measure originally used to weigh wooden horses to see if they were suspiciously heavy. And troy ounces are nearly 10% heavier than the other kind and significantly shinier too. But even so, $1,350 an ounce, it's a lot. To give you some idea of how much, let's say, madam, may I ask you, how much do you weigh? No idea? No? OK, listen. I'll take a guess. Let's say you're about 10 stone. I'm being generous. I mean, in terms of... I'm being generous, as in I'm giving you a lot of stones. I'm not being generous emotionally. I'm being harsh emotionally. I'm being generous, like a generous portion of something. So, has anyone ever told you that you are worth your weight in gold? They have. Excellent. Well done. What were you doing at the time? OK, keep it to yourself. It's fine. He's sitting right there, for God's sake. So... did you wonder how much that might be? No, it wouldn't occur to you. But let me tell you, if you were, let's say you are 10 stone, that's just an average weight for a female adult in this country. I wish, but you're around that. That would work out at about 2,100 troy ounces, which would put you on the London exchanges at £1.7 million. Quite a healthy amount, isn't it? To work out whether you genuinely are worth your weight in gold, we would have to know how old you were and how much time you had left as, as a professional. I'm not going to go because you've already given yourself up to an extraordinary degree. Fact is, to be honest, you're depreciating at a fast rate now. It's not personal. This is just what happens to humans, which is why gold, is a more valuable commodity than most of us are. But there it is. So that's given us some idea. A 10-stone person, male or female, would be worth about £1.7 million. Despite what Tim has said earlier, I'm still not convinced that it has any unique qualities which make it uniquely appropriate for coinage and currency. Why not, for instance, say diamonds? Merryn?
Diamonds are absolutely useless. Apart from anything else, they're not in short supply. This is a great myth invented by De Beers. Well done, De Beers. But there are diamonds all over the place. Diamonds also come in different grades. There's crap diamonds and there's good diamonds. Gold, there's only one gold. It's always the same. So if you had diamonds, you'd be constantly saying, well, that's a rubbish diamond. That diamond is only worth half of my diamond because I've got a good diamond.
I think it tells us more about Merryn than it does about diamonds. That she thinks they're everywhere. Clear these bloody diamonds up, will you? Tim, Merryn says gold is rare. Is there a measure, is there a scale on which rarity can be defined?
We have an idea about how much there is in the world. There are different estimates, and they do disagree, but if you put it on centre court at Wimbledon, it would be just short of 10 metres high. So actually, not that much when you think of all the gold in the world, but we don't really know. There could be loads in some supervillain's bank vaults.
And has anyone ever worked out what kind of a playing surface that would offer? Who would that favour? Rafa Nadal, I reckon. Yeah. Let's discuss the fundamentals about gold and see if we can find some kind of quality in the stuff that explains its huge value. Right back to basics. It's known to crossword enthusiasts by its chemical symbol AU, which I've always thought is kind of appropriate, as in AU. It does seem to beckon to us, doesn't it? AU, come over here. I show you a good time. No. Chemically, gold is an unusually inert metal and, like Homer Simpson, is dense, yellow and surprisingly soft. And also occasionally radioactive. Gold is mined on every continent on Earth except Antarctica, and that's only due to meddling environmentalists. can only keep us away for so long. This is probably a reflection of the fact that almost all of the gold ever found arrived here in a meteor shower some 3.8 billion years ago. That's right, gold is genuinely otherworldly. It all comes from outer space. And that's also, incidentally, why it's mostly quite near the surface, in Earth terms, generally speaking. The single largest nugget ever found was in Australia, just 2 inches below the surface dirt. It was over 2 feet long and yielded 2,248 ounces of pure gold. That nugget, incidentally, was named the Welcome Stranger Nugget by its uncharacteristically poetic Australian prospector. Presumably Big Yella was already taken. And equally, during the great California gold rush of the mid-19th century, tons of the stuff literally was found lying around in the dirt and blocking up the rivers. This gold rush, incidentally, pretty much populated the west of America and introduced the whole new 2.0 version of America itself. Whereas previously the American dream had been about the traditional Walton's family values of patience and humility, suddenly it became all about guns, loud trousers, and massive lumps of money growing out of the California soil. Thanks, gold. Having said that, most countries do have their destiny determined at some stage by their access to particular mineral deposits. That's just a reality. We in this country, I think, in the United Kingdom, have always been rather sniffy about countries that get their wealth through mineral deposits. We like to think we're more of a skills-based economy. Our primary skill, of course, traditionally having been that of persuading other countries to give us their mineral deposits. So, worth bearing in mind. Tim. Gold has been found in every part of the world and by every civilization, but they haven't all treated it with equal reverence, have they?
Well, some of the South American and Central American civilizations before the conquistadors arrived, there was a lot of gold, and they weren't using it in the way that the Spanish felt it should be used. They were sort of sprinkling it around, and the Incas didn't really have money at all. They just had a system where you did what you were told rather than because somebody paid you to do it. And the Mayans apparently used feathers of a bird called the resplendent quetzal.
The resplendent quetzal?
Yeah.
I've never, is it like a parrot or something?
I think it's resplendent.
Rather resplendent, yeah.
The clue's in the name.
And they used its feathers as money?
Yeah, and they just
used
had gold.
the gold just to scribble all over the walls.
John Maynard Keynes had this essay where he pointed out that the money that Francis Drake had taken from the Spaniards, given to Queen Elizabeth, she had invested that, compound interest. It was an important part of kick-starting the British Empire and making Britain what it is today. He actually forecast what size the economy would be round about now, how rich we would be, very accurately. What he didn't understand is that rather than sort of knocking off work on a Tuesday lunchtime, we'd actually keep working and spending all the money on buying houses and so on, rather than just relaxing, sitting around, having sex with strangers and reading poetry. As Keynes and his friends like to do.
The life of an economist. Yeah. So our good fortune by world standards over the last few hundred years was largely down to the gold that Drake robbed from the thieving Spaniards back in 1560 or whatever.
That's the theory.
And that kick-started the whole thing. To help us unpick that story, I'm joined by the author of economics bestseller Life After the State. He writes on Commodities for Money Week magazine, Dominic Frisby. Dominic, thanks very much for coming along. Now, gold, you're saying it's not currently as politically sensitive as it once was, but it wasn't that long ago that countries pegged their currency to something called the gold standard.
Well, the way that the gold standard worked, in simple terms, is that the central bank would take people's gold and they would issue notes in exchange for this gold, and that note said, I promise to pay the bearer X amount, and people stopped using gold coins in the marketplace, and they started using these notes in the marketplace instead. So paper money, representative money, was replacing commodity money, effectively. And gradually, over time, central banks decided to regulate this practice. They took a monopoly of it, if you like, and the central bank was only, or the Bank of England, for example, could only issue as much paper as it had gold in the vaults.
Right. No leverage at all.
Well, they found ways round it. During the Napoleonic Wars, they needed to print money to pay for it. We come to 1914, the outbreak of World War I. Germany, France, and Britain, we all took our countries off the gold standard to print the money that we needed to pay for that war. And it was only by coming off the gold standard, that the war was able to go on for as long as it did.
Wow.
In 1971, America had a very expensive war in Vietnam that it needed to pay for, and it had printed way more dollars than it had gold to back them. And France, Charles de Gaulle, started saying, actually, you can have your dollars, we'll take the gold. There was a run on American gold, and as a result, in 1971, America came off the gold standard.
And at that point, I know that gold shot up in value. Almost
It
immediately.
did. Well, over the next 10 years, it went from $35 an ounce to $850.
Whereas the dollar sort of slunk off into a bathroom.
All the money that had been printed and created through the 1960s, the effects of all that came in the 1970s through the huge inflation that we had.
So now, on a personal note, Dominic, you got involved in this, didn't you? You decided to take an interest. It was about, what, 2005?
2005, 2006, I knew nothing. I became very interested in economics and finance, and it became very clear to me that the world, that we had way too much leverage, there was too much debt, we were about to, and it was all going to unravel, and we were going to go to hell in a handbasket. And it still amazes me, no economist of any note saw it coming. No broadcast, no journalist, no economist. There was this huge bubble. And so I sold my overpriced terraced house in London, and I got rid of my mortgage. The word for a mortgage is actually death grip, is the root of that word. And I rolled the money into gold.
And did people say to you, you're mad?
Everyone thought I was absolutely insane. But the plan was to sell the terraced house, buy gold, when it all went tits up, sell the gold and buy a palace. That was the that was the rough plan. The way it panned out is that I was doing very well. By about 2011, that terraced house had become maybe a detached house. But unfortunately, since 2011, the housing market's rocketed and the gold market's done that. So I'm back at terraced house, unfortunately.
But you haven't been ruined, at least.
I haven't been ruined, and I'm hoping for a loft conversion soon.
Now, when you did that in 2005, did you find yourself falling into step? Did you find you had a lot of very queer bedfellows? Because there are a number of people who, gold bugs, they call them, who believe that gold is at the root of a conspiracy of worldwide banking and politics and so on.
Well, gold, even now, it's still a really political metal. And, for example, the USA, its only foreign exchange, it doesn't have any foreign exchange except gold. And its gold hasn't been audited in 50 years. And so people go, sorry?
I'm sure it's still there.
Well, that's the big... Well, of course I'm sure it's still there, but the joke is the head of security goes to President Obama and he says, Mr. Obama, there's no gold in Fort Knox. And Obama says, what do you mean there's no gold in Fort Knox? And he said, well, there's no gold in Fort Knox. And Obama says, double the guard. But, I mean, I'm almost sure it's all there, but until they audit it, we don't know that it's all there, and it has to be audited independently. And when you don't know a truth, conspiracy theories develop.
And meanwhile, the last great folly involving gold was probably that of Gordon Brown, who was wandering through the Exchequer one day and stubbed his toe on a big lump of the stuff and decided to flog it all out of spite.
Well...
This was in, I think, about 2001?
1999 it was, and it didn't mark just the low in the gold price, it marked the low in gold relative to housing, relative to stocks, relative to the bond market, relative to just about anything you can think of.
He literally couldn't have chosen a worse time.
The all-time low, not just of our lifetime, in history. I mean, it was the most phenomenally bad trade that has ever been made.
And just finally, before I let you sit down, you've been fantastically interesting, Dominic. Just one last thing. You're now writing a book, I believe, about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and some people have said this is, in a sense, is the new gold, because it is another thing into which we simply we invest its wealth, its value, without it having any intrinsic value. We believe it does. And so is it working in a similar way, or are there...
Well, there seems to be a 100-year cycle in money. 1716, the first recoinage, 1816, 1914, and the monetary system that we currently operate under is screwed. There is too much debt, it is corrupt, it is... Terrible things have happened. It's also not that technologically advanced. It is controlled by banks and governments. They have a virtual duopoly. And Bitcoin, or let's expand it out and say new forms of digital cash, offer a new technology by which people can make and receive payments that doesn't involve banks. And I personally believe that if not Bitcoin, maybe Bitcoin has to fail so that others can succeed, but it is going to lead to the future of money lies in some kind of manifestation of digital cash. Fantastic.
Very, very interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, Dominic Frisby, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Tim, have you learned something?
I've learnt a lot. I've learnt that gold protects us from governments wantonly printing money, except every time they actually want to. Napoleonic Wars. First of all, whenever they want to, they'll do it anyway. So.
But it gives them a brief pause, and I suppose it at least alerts us to the fact that they're up to something at that point. Have you? I mean, as an economist, do economists find gold fascinating, or do they regard it as a slightly sterile subject now?
I think economists find it fascinating in the sort of we don't really understand what all the fuss is about sort of way. I mean, there must be something in it. If economists all think it's nonsense, there's probably something in it.
Would you buy any?
No. I mean, for me, gold, it's a bit like Wile E. Coyote in the Roadrunner cartoons, just not yet realising that gravity applies.
The strangest money, perhaps, in human history comes from the island of Yap in the South Pacific. And Victorian anthropologists who arrived on the island of Yap found that up to 10% of the male population of Yap were taking rafts over to Palau and mining this money and bringing it back to Yap. And the money was a kind of stone donut. Sometimes it was quite small, about the size of an actual donut. But some of these donuts were absolutely colossal. There'd be a couple of yards across, they'd weigh as much as a small car. And those were the really valuable coins. Now, the curious thing about this money is it was obviously rather inconvenient to move it. So I might want to buy a pig from Simon, and we'd agree the transaction, but we wouldn't actually move the coin because it was too much of a faff. Everyone would just know, well, that donut out the back of Tim's house, well, that's now Simon's donut. And so these transactions would take place in this entirely mental space. Everybody would just know who owned which donut, and the donuts would never, ever move. There was even a case where one of these rafts coming back from Palau sank half a mile off the coast of Yap, and everyone agreed, well, we knew whose donut that was, and it's perfectly good money. It's just down there at the bottom of the sea. So, very, very curious system. You think, well, this makes no sense whatsoever. And then you think about our own monetary system. It used to be that we would have gold and we'd pay each other in gold, but that was inconvenient and very insecure, so we'd put the gold in bank vaults. And if we wanted to pay somebody, you could go to the vault, but it might be easier just to write a little note that says that you own the gold and pass that note to somebody else. So now you're passing this paper money around. The gold, just like the stone money, is staying exactly where you put it. And all you're doing is passing the bits of paper around that says, well, that used to be Tim's gold, now it's Simon's gold. So I'm not sure that the stone money of Yap is quite as weird as we think. We've now taken the ultimate step. We don't bother with the gold anymore. We just pass the paper money around, and it doesn't refer to anything at all.
Still, it clearly is regarded as a safe haven at the very least, and not just by wild-eyed survivalists and conspiracy theorists. Merryn Somerset-Webb, who is on the line from Edinburgh, holds down a very steady job, and yet she says gold is still important.
Well, this is the very interesting thing. If you ask most economists, they'll tell you that gold does nothing, that it's meaningless, that it's all over. The gold standard was years ago and no one's interested in gold anymore. But then you see that every single central bank around the world holds huge amounts of gold on their balance sheet. And if it isn't important at all, what do they want this stuff for? And the reason everybody wants it is that it hedges their dollar exposure. So if you've got lots of dollars, when the dollar price falls, the gold price rises, so it hedges that. But also it is still, even today, recognized as the only real long-term store of value that we have. There isn't anything else that is recognized all over the world by every culture, by every economy, as having an intrinsic value of some kind.
Well, there it is. Gold remains an enigma, but perhaps that is its strength. The bottom line is that gold still draws on a significant consensus that it offers a hedge to the short-termist political machinations of Westminster buffoons, not to mention their US counterparts, and there can be few people who don't acknowledge at least some virtue in that. If you want to take our experts' median view, let gold account for between 5 and 10% of your portfolio, but try not to stay up too late on the internet reading about why it may or may not be running the entire world. And if you want my view, don't buy shares in a fund, don't buy bullion, and certainly don't buy shares in a mining company. Get yourself some ducats, some sovereigns, some Krugerrands, some pieces of 8, some big, exciting, lumpy nuggets, and maybe a nice little chest to keep them in, perhaps a map too, and a few yards of oilcloth. And yes, why the hell not a parrot? In fact, a resplendent Quetzal, who knows? It could be the start of a great adventure. Thank you very much. I've been Simon Evans. Take care. Good night. You have been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market with me, Simon Evans, Tim Harford, Merryn, Somerset-Webb and Dominic Frisby. It was written by Simon Evans with Benjamin Partridge, Guy Venables and Andy Walton. And the producer is Talusha Galani. To Simon Evans Goes to Market, Radio 4's premier comedy economics show, with the possible exception of that episode of Moneybox Live when Vincent Duggleby audibly ponked during a guide to claiming compensation for missold PPI. Comedy economics is in fact a fairly new genre for radio for reasons that are becoming ever clearer to me with each new recording. So new, in fact, that I am in the lucky position of being allowed to name it. Some have suggested Evanomics, but I'll be damned if that bloke off the Today programme gets any credit. So, it's a toss-up between Simonomics and Simonomics. So... But why, when you can no doubt find a rerun of some comedy on Dave that won't require you to furrow your brow in confusion on the way to a punchline, should you choose instead to agree to take some financial roughage with your jokes? Well, to my mind, the world is run by the people who understand this stuff. So if you don't, then you're forever destined to dance to their tune. And yet it really isn't as complicated as they'd like you to believe. Supply and demand, opportunity cost, comparative advantage. If nothing else, you'll start to understand why you're broke. And surely, if we all spent a little less time cutting coupons out of the paper and driving to that Asda in the retail park in Nottingham to save tuppence on a litre of petrol, and spent that time instead studying the pink pages, it would literally and figuratively pay dividends. So next time you find yourself swearing at your printer as it fails to deliver your precious Pizza Express voucher for free dough balls, stop. Shut down your laptop, get the business section back out of the bin, learn about the markets and get involved. You could become rich beyond your wildest dreams. Or you might lose everything and then you'll have to go the whole hog and move to Nottingham. At least you'll be closer to that Asda. I remember appearing some years ago on an old Radio 4 panel game. It was called something like the News Quiz. That was it, the News Quiz. And the panel featured the usual broad range of political sympathies heard on Radio 4's comedy slot, from disgruntled socialist polytechnic lecturer to raving trot. The subject came round to petrol prices, which had been rising fast enough to justify plenty of newsprint, and there was a general sense that the city fat cats were to blame, and I chipped in something to the effect that I too felt that the price rises were due to corporate profiteering and had accordingly just bought a fistful of shares in BP. The audience stared back at me in much the same way that they would have done if I'd unzipped my skin, unfolded a large pair of leather wings and started flapping around in the radio theatre, swooping down to pluck up their young. Now, you could argue that taking the single least successful joke I'd ever attempted to crack on radio, one which basically ended my career on Radio 4 panel games, and evolving it into an entire 4-part comedy series, smacks more of revenge fantasy than sensible commissioning. Tonight on Simon Evans Goes to Market, it's the big one, the one which finished off my career on the News Quiz and may still do the same for Mother Earth herself. It's cowboys. No, it's not. It's not cowboys, it's oil. Now, The oil markets are famously treacherous territory, so to help me find a path through the thickets, I have with me two genuine experts in the field. On the line, from her dwelling as ever in financial nirvana, Editor-in-Chief of Money Week, the highly respected and unusually for an investment pundit actually quite well off, Merryn Somerset-Webb. And sitting just to my right, I have FT economist and Radio 4's award-winning statistician, poor but happy Tim Harford. Tim, statistician, perhaps the least exciting word ever to appear after award-winning. But still, a win is a win. Tim, tell me, was the silence of the news quiz audience that evening more due to embarrassment at my naivety than an affront to theirs?
I'm not sure it was actually an economic critique. I just think they didn't find it funny. But
it wasn't a very good joke, you're right.
But actually, the economics works fine. When your petrol got more expensive, you would have made money on your share portfolio, and that would have hedged your risk.
Well, that's the idea. That's what we're looking for this evening. What is the best way to try and understand petrol, economically speaking, and to benefit from its apparently ever-growing rise in price?
Well, the price of petrol, apart from representing an outrage to Jeremy Clarkson, is a surprising amount of it is actually tax. Petrol at, I don't know, 1.35 a litre, something like that. About 80 pence of that is tax. 45 pence of that is the raw material, the crude oil. About 1.5 pence is the cost of refining it. And a massive 7 pence is the colossal profiteering of the person selling you the petrol.
Wow, that's not a huge margin then, really, for that.
It's not a massive margin. The Chancellor is taking a tremendous amount of money at the petrol pump.
Yet crude oil isn't just about petrol, of course. What else do we get from crude?
All sorts of things. So liquid petroleum gas, jet fuel, diesel, plastics, asphalt, lubes.
Lubes?
Oh,
Vaseline?
Yeah,
When they
example.
say petroleum jelly. This is the stuff you put on blisters if you've forgotten to put it on beforehand.
Yeah.
Yeah, OK. So, interesting. And how much of this stuff do we use at the moment?
We use about 90 million barrels a day.
Who is using the most of that at the moment?
Well, we can blame the Americans. They're using about 20% of the world's oil, although they only have about 4% of the world's population. But of course, any wealthy economy burns a lot of oil. It's interesting, the oil consumption of the rich world, the OECD, hasn't really changed very much for 20 years, while the oil consumption of the rest of the world has nearly doubled.
So the rest of the world is now aspiring to the American lifestyle of driving around in a ludicrously huge SUV, which in turn makes you fat because you no longer walk anywhere, which in turn means you have to buy ever larger cars in order to fit into them. And so perhaps the best way to hedge against petrol prices is actually to buy diet plans for ever-growing larger, fatter people all over the world.
Whatever you say, Simon.
Yeah, OK, well, just, trying to find some non-conventional ways of profiting. On top of that, we have the question of peak oil. Maybe oil is about to run out.
Which would be worrying if it was true. Now, if we do start to run out of oil, it will drive oil prices up. And there's a surprising connection between oil prices and the world economy. Think about the last 40 years of economic history. We had the 1970s, terrible, terrible economic times, very, very high oil prices. Oil prices fall in the mid-1980s. There's a boom. Some people give credit to Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, free market economics. Well, maybe a bit of that, but also low oil prices. Then we have the 1990s, the Clinton years, new Labour, everything's going great. We're talking about new technology, but it's also cheap oil. And then we have the dot-com bust. Everyone's worried, the economy seems to be slowing down, but we also have expensive oil. And we've had 10, 12 years now of very expensive oil, and we've had a dramatic economic slowdown. Maybe it's the banking crisis, but maybe oil has also played a role. So this stuff really does matter.
This is very serious stuff, and it's not looking like it's going to get cheaper anytime soon. Maybe we are simply screwed, in which case, just go home and build a bunker. However, and on top of all of that, we have climate change, of course. It could really be time for oil and humanity to begin to contemplate conscious uncoupling. OK, let's have a look at the stuff itself. Oil, gloopy, disgusting, magical oil. For Venezuelan statesman Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, it was el excremento del diablo, the devil's excrement. Although technically that would suggest that Satan has a largely vegan diet, which seems unlikely. My first memory of oil was from 1978, when the Amoco Cadiz foundered off the coast of France and spilled 70 million gallons of oil into the English Channel. You notice that? Hits France, poisons English Channel. I remember seeing that on Newsround. John Craven in a bad cagoule looking at some seagulls. More disappointed than angry. The only deliberately visible expression of oil I can remember from my childhood was as a lubricant. My dad did have a bottle of something called 3-in-1 oil, and I always wondered what that referred to exactly, but... I'm talking about a commercial on the television for Castrol GTX, in which a drop of oil slowly but purposefully made its way across various metallic surfaces before eventually pooling into the open embrace of a spanner. I'm not sure what size the spanner was, Tim.
I think it was a 9/16, Simon, but it's hard to be sure.
OK, that's good enough for me. I don't know if this music will bring it to mind for many of you. It is straight. It is curved. It is the precise shape of every moving part it clings to. Oil is too small a word for it. It is liquid engineering. On close examination, of course, that notion doesn't really stand up. Oil is too small a word for it. Many of the things the British respect and understand to be complex and subtle are denoted in monosyllables. God, home, pub. Even in the 1980s, no one ever said, pub is too short a word for it. It is a badly carpeted drinking environment. Still, that was what I thought oil was, a lubricant. Certainly it was pretty harmless stuff. No one ever really explained to me that oil was why we no longer had to spend most of our lives grubbing for roots or huddled round a warm rock or even what you could really call pushing our own lawnmowers. Even as adults, we are rarely required to confront the stuff. The casual observer would presume that most service stations were simply roadside supermarkets and that their core business was conducted with one of the 18 different Costa coffee outlets per forecourt than with the petrol pumps. It is only right that coffee should be a kind of visible stand-in for petrol at the pumps, of course. Coffee is the second most valuable commodity in the world, after oil, and like oil, it is black, it speeds things up, and it tastes filthy without enough sugar in it. But the essential truth about coffee is that it actually works by poisoning us ever so slightly so that our metabolism accelerates in order to excrete it more quickly. We feel excited as we surge that much faster towards death. And oil works on the planet in pretty much exactly the same way. So both processes end inevitably with an almighty dump. Still, scatological metaphors aside, perhaps we should ascertain what oil actually is. Tim, tell me, when did we first start getting interested in the stuff? Because we knew it was there, right, for centuries.
We knew it was there, but it didn't seem to be useful for anything very much. It used to get in the way of salt mining and useful stuff like that.
Are you saying people would actually shout, oh no, we've struck oil?
Yeah. Getting in the way of the salt.
Days.
Yeah. And originally, oil came from whales.
Whales?
From sperm whales.
Oh, sperm whales, not from where... No, don't tell them that, they'll want independence all over here.
So it came from sperm whales, and it wasn't used to drive cars around or anything like that. It was used to light lamps.
So we were hunting whales just to replace candles, just for a finer alternative to candles?
Yeah, and then something terrible happened, which is that we ran out of whales.
Oh, I thought for a minute you were going to say we realised we were being utterly beastly about the whole thing. No.
We're still waiting for that. So we ran out of whales, and then people started trying to figure out whether there was any alternative, and they said, well, maybe this stuff that comes out of the ground in places like Texas, we could use that.
So until this point, people had seen oil for centuries, but it never occurred to them that it could be refined and put to work.
Exactly.
Much like whales, in fact. So this was, 1850, 1860s? And for the first few decades, oil was essentially used as a light oil.
Well, what else are you going to use it for? You don't need to use it to run steam engines because you've already got coal. And eventually Winston Churchill came up with a brilliant idea that maybe he could convert the British fleet. This is the early 20th century.
Right.
Maybe he could convert the British fleet to run on oil. And at that point, it started to become geopolitically interesting.
And also at this point, we've already got motor cars appearing in America.
By the 20s and 30s, they're starting to become economically significant. And oil is something you really need if you're going to run a motor car. At which point you get men like John D. Rockefeller becoming, well, by some measures, the richest man in the world. So that all happened really within a human lifetime, from oil being almost irrelevant to oil being the source of wealth of the richest man alive.
So what is it specifically about oil that separates it from these other fuels?
It's brilliant for transport. And the reason is, if you're going to power a car or a truck, you need to carry your fuel around with you. And so it matters how much space it takes up, and it matters how heavy it is. And petrol is extremely light, so that the energy density in a kilogram of petrol is maybe 20, 30, even 50 times greater than the energy density inside a really good battery. And that's why it's still so hard to make electric cars that will run 500 miles and can be recharged really quickly. It's much, much easier to make them run on gasoline.
Just to give it as a comparison, compare it to the power within the human being. How much more, what have you got in a gallon of petrol?
So we could, let's pick an arbitrary unit, like the Wigo. So a Wigo is the amount of power that Sir Bradley Wiggins can generate.
Sir Bradley Wiggins, the Olympic cyclist?
Yeah. And he's quite handy. So he can generate 500 watts for a reasonably extended period of time, sort of 10 or 20 minutes. So if Sir Bradley Wiggins was cycling for 10 hours pretty much flat out, actually he couldn't, but let's assume he could, that would be 5 kilowatt hours. There are 1,600 kilowatt hours in a barrel of crude oil. So that's Sir Bradley Wiggins cycling flat out 10 hours a day for a year.
And that's in a single barrel of oil?
One barrel of oil.
Which currently costs about $100 on the World Exchange and is considered to be pricey at that. I mean, that's basically like having an army of slaves at our disposal, isn't it?
I don't like to think of enslaving Sir Bradley Wiggins. Not on the radio, anyway.
Wow. It's no wonder this stuff doesn't always bring out the best in us. It's not been an easy transition politically for man to become aware of the value beneath his feet in certain cases. Many countries have suffered from what is known as the curse of oil.
Well, this is what the Venezuelan statesman who talked about the devil's excrement was worried about. He said that Venezuela was going to drown in the devil's excrement. And when you look at places that have struck oil, some have done very well. They've managed to manage it reasonably well. Norway comes to mind. So Norway...
That'd be about it.
Yeah, that's about it. And then you look at Nigeria, for example. Nigeria between 1950 and the early 1970s, no oil, the shock of independence, massive civil war, killed many hundreds of thousands of people, much stronger economic growth than Nigeria enjoyed, say, between the 1970s and the end of the 20th century after they struck oil. And many other countries have really struggled because oil skews your economy away from producing almost anything other than oil. And it also really corrodes your political system. You have an entire political system that's basically revolves around some strong guy at the top. He's got control of the oil, and then the money is passed down a pyramid, and you've got an autocratic system. And actually, there are not very many stable democracies which also have a lot of oil.
Like the chalk hills of the South Downs, the golden sands of the Gower Peninsula, and I strongly suspect Marmite, oil is the earthly remains of trillions of long-dead organisms. If you Google the words origins of oil, which I did despite the fact that I am clearly an authority myself, the first result on page 1 is an article by a Dr. Andrew Snelling, PhD, in which he posits that oil began to form in the immediate aftermath of the catastrophic worldwide Genesis flood. Yeah, that is Google's #1 offer for the origins of oil. Essentially, his creationist analysis is that oil is the remains of everything that was uprooted or drowned by the sudden downpour about 6,000 years ago. And given that God sent that flood to punish evil, we have to assume that wherever the oil is, that's where the evil was, which does at least explain Texas, Saudi Arabia, Aberdeen. Oil is essentially a battery for storing ancient sunshine. Most sober scientists agree that the origins of oil stretch back a little further than 6,000 years, perhaps as much as 500 million. Given that plastic is made from oil and oil is made partly from dinosaurs, you might well wonder how much of any given plastic dinosaur is actually made of dinosaur. Tim, that feels like a statistical inquiry.
I'm really sorry to break it to you, Simon. It is basically mostly plants.
Mostly plants is okay. But homeopathic quantities of dinosaur.
Exactly.
That's fine. Even now, of course, America, which is, still militarily the most powerful country in the world, an awful lot of its activities, most people squint at and think, where's the oil in this? That's the first thing that people think about them. The war in Iraq, people said, it's a bit of a coincidence that you seem to be interested in spreading democracy in this particular nation. The second largest oil field in the world is the one where you're focused on. But even that, apparently, is a slightly naive reading of the Iraq war. Some people have suggested that the main problem that America had with Iraq was that it was beginning to trade its oil in euros, and that traditionally oil has always been traded in dollars, and that is the one thing that maintains the dollar's position as the reserve currency of the world. I talked about this to Merryn Somerset-Webb, who is editor-in-chief of Money Week, and a very sober and intelligent and well-informed journalist and authority on these things, unlikely to get as overexcited as I would when faced with these sort of sinister notions. But she didn't exactly deny it.
It is conceivable. Yeah. It is conceivable. I have to say, I think it's very unlikely that anyone would be stupid enough to start such an awful war on such a basis. But it is entirely possible, yes. If it was the case that over the period of a year everyone switched from buying oil in dollars to buying it in euros, it would have an enormous impact on the US. I think it's called a conspiracy theory because that's really what it is.
She didn't deny it. So... Destabilising the planet economically, politically and environmentally, oil really is too small a word for it. It is liquid trouble. Joining me now to try and help me formulate a lifelong investment strategy in the next 5 minutes is the current global head of commodities at Standard Chartered plc. He was previously managing director and head of commodities research at Barclays Capital and head of energy research at JP Morgan. He's the author of Oil in Asia and Oil Markets and Prices. He holds a degree in philosophy, politics and economics and a doctorate in economics, both from Keble College, Oxford. He is, in short, ludicrously overqualified for the level of questioning I'm going to be capable of taxing him with. And it won't surprise or offend me if he decides to resume a game of online Scrabble on his phone while we're talking. Please welcome Paul Horsnell. Paul, first question, is everything broadly speaking right that we've said so far?
Yeah, I think you may have nailed it. Well, you've certainly used a hammer on it.
This thing of petrodollars, the idea that oil is only traded around the world in dollars. Is that correct?
Oh, 99%.
99%, OK. And how important is that to the security of the American economy?
I think the analogy would be to look at another market, say fashion, because fashion oil is the same thing, as you can see the way I'm dressed here today.
For those of you listening to this on radio, Paul is very badly dressed.
Gisele Bündchen, the famous Brazilian supermodel, at one point refused to take any payment in dollars. She thought that the dollar was going to go down against the euros, so she was only going to be paid in euros. And she didn't get invaded, so I think it's unlikely.
The point is, the American economy has been stiff for a long time. It has ludicrous levels of debt, and they are utterly profligate. They seem to have no interest whatsoever in balancing their trade deficit or any of the rest of it. And the reason is that they know the world has to own dollars in huge quantities if it wants to do international trade, because it's the world's reserve currency. If people started trading oil in euros, then the dollar would plummet in value. The Americans would no longer be able to import the nice things that they want to live with. There would be riots, and they would be back in the Stone Age or the Corn Age or whatever they are. But that's the previous. When Iraq started trading in euros, that did put the wind up them. They were invaded very shortly afterwards, and they are now back to trading in dollars.
Yeah, at the time, actually, Iraq wasn't producing that much oil because it was facing sanctions, so it was a relatively small amount. But you're right, and certainly for the world economy, yes, of course it matters which currency we traded in. Oil is such a large part of world trade.
OK, I don't want to sound like I'm barking mad, so I'll leave it there, but I still think there's something. Without oil, nothing else functions, nothing else works. It's kind of, when you buy into oil, you are buying the heart of the economy. But many people say it's just too volatile to invest in directly. Is there something to that?
Well, a lot of the stock market is made up of oil and gas companies. So in a sense, if you're paying into a pension, you've already got a large exposure to oil and gas. So it's there. And the question is whether you need more exposure. And I think one way looking at the oil industry in the future, it's going to be spending a lot of money. It's got to do a lot of drilling. It's got to build a lot of ships, it's got to move things around, it's got to explore for more, it's got to develop more, it's got to build pipes. There's going to be a lot of money going into companies that actually build things and do things around, the engineering companies, the so-called service companies.
So you would suggest buying shares in Halliburton, basically, and then just waiting for the next big invasion. That's what you're saying?
There are other service companies.
But peak oil is misunderstood. That's not going to happen immediately. It just gets more and more expensive to get our hands on.
I think so. I mean, the best answer to are we going to run out of oil, is the oil age going to end, I think was given by Sheikh Yamani, the famous Saudi oil minister, who had better comic timing than any other OPEC oil minister. So he was asked that question. He paused for a long time, just stroked his beard a bit, and then he answered, the Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stones.
Following his Stone Age analogy, in terms of what we might move on to, alternative energy sources, renewables as they call them, wind turbines, for instance, which seem mainly there to blight Jeremy Clarkson's view of the Cotswolds, which I thoroughly approve of, obviously, and, if they do generate energy at all, it's probably in the heat given off from his face when he looks out of them. They're not really doing anything at all, are they, renewables, compared to the amount of energy delivered by oil?
There's not very much come from renewables yet, but certainly if you look at the carbon dioxide numbers and what we need to do to stabilise carbon dioxide emissions, then those renewables are going to have to make up a much greater proportion. At the moment, oil has got itself very concentrated in these areas, such as transport, where it's very hard to do wind to substitute in for transport. You need a great big windmill on top of your car, and it looks a bit silly.
Yeah. Which would be fine once you were going along, but that...
Once you're going along, that'd be absolutely perfect.
And now, as far as the newer sources, shale oil and sand, tar and so on, the impression I get is it's a bit like saying, yeah, there's loads of honey, I dropped a jar of it on the floor over there, you've just got to spit the broken glass out. It's a filthy, nasty, hideous business, and it's never going to be efficient. Is there some slightly latitudinal approach to investing in a future in which oil is never cheap again?
I think for practical purposes, for most people, it is not necessarily probably just the big oil companies, but looking at the small oil companies, who's exploring somewhere interesting, somewhere where there might be oil but they haven't done much before. Again, who's making those pipes? Who's doing all of this huge amount of activity? So again, it's going to be an industry which will have billions and billions of dollars of expenditure, and will need that really just to keep this energy flow going.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Horsnell. So there we have it. Oil has been our slave for 150 years. Virtually everything that you buy, that you own, that you wear, drink, eat, watch, listen to, temporarily endow with erotic charge, has its own little tank. And if all those lovely little items can no longer afford to fill their tanks, then you're going to start noticing. Better hedge now, buy shares in oil, or maybe bunkers and Ray Mears box sets. So, what have we learnt? We use 90 million barrels of oil a day, which means, scaling up my favourite Jamie Oliver recipe, we now need 40 million barrels of balsamic vinegar and 20 million barrels of lemon juice. And a really massive piece of salmon. Most of the price of a litre of petrol is actually tax, with petrol stations only making around 7 pence per litre. Most of their money actually comes from Ginster's pasties, although, like petrol, they too are made of organic matter that died a long, long time ago. And you really are better off investing in oil. The reserves are running out, but don't panic. No matter how high the prices rise, no one will ever riot, because you'd have to be a millionaire to afford the petrol bombs. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good night. Listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market with me, Simon Evans, Tim Harford, Merryn, Somerset-Webb and Paul Horsnell. It was written by Simon Evans with Benjamin Partridge and Andy Walton, and the producer is Talusha Galani. Welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. Thank you and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. If you missed the first series, don't worry. A few hours with Adam Smith, Thomas Piketty and the Puffin Joke Book will bring you right up to speed. This time around, we're going to look at the markets in human weakness. Alcohol, sugar, coffee and tobacco. Now, I know you think economics is boring and that you're too stupid to understand it, but actually only one of those things is true. Yes. Even a cursory understanding of economics can help you see how the world works and could change your life, possibly even for the better. For example, if only Alanis Morissette had grasped the principles of trade, she wouldn't have minded that she had 10,000 spoons when all she needed was a knife. Out there was someone else with half a ton of knives and a bowl of soup that was going cold. Even Alanis, with her poor grasp of irony, could surely see that she was in a strong bargaining position. She cornered the spoon market, which, given the angle-free geometry of the spoon, really is ironic. However, this episode is not about spoons, but alcohol and how economics might help our understanding of our relationship with it. Alcohol itself, of course, needs no introduction, and nor do you, it seems, if you've had a few. For many of us, a drink remains the easiest way to dissolve the inhibitions that can prevent us from making a right tit of ourselves. No wonder it's popular, with 85% of us enjoying at least the occasional snifter. Now, alcohol has certainly assumed a central, if supporting role in many of our lives, and yet some people have managed to resist its siren call, lashing themselves to the mast rather than going out on the lash. I wanted to use one as a guinea pig, and one of them, incredibly, is in the employ of the BBC and is with us tonight. Our series guinea pig, Andy, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Andy is teetotal, pretty much. Is that right, Andy?
Christmas, I'll have a sherry, which I won't like.
You've been making yourself at home with the complimentary nuts and savoury snacks, I believe?
Yep.
Excellent. So hopefully you'll be starting to understand the economics of complimentary snacks, which is that you now have a raging thirst, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to start you off with a nice glass of red wine, whose tannins and flavonoids are universally acknowledged to be a good thing, and which, if drunk in moderation, reduce the risk of stroke, Alzheimer's, and sadness.
Thanks.
You're welcome. That'll be £12.80, please, if you can just pop it on the table. Don't feel too ripped off, however. You have there got what is now known in pubs as a large glass, which is, size-wise, basically a bottle with the neck sawn off. So, one of many clever little tricks that the pubs have pulled on us lately.
Do you want me to sort of give you tasting notes with the sort of the flowers and woody tastes?
Yeah, righto. Just get it down your neck, son. When you've had that, you can chase that down with a few lagers or a craft beer. It's only a half-hour programme, however, so later on, when you start to feel a bit bloated, we'll move you on to shorts, OK? You have a seat there and try not to get into any fights. So, I like a drink as much as the next man, which is to say 11.6 litres of pure alcohol per year. And the day I learned to spread that out a bit over the whole 12 months was one that saved my life. Those litres all add up, however, and the value of the UK drinks industry is a cool £38 billion. It's also a massive export business, especially whisky, which accounts for 67% of the off-island trade and fully a quarter of all UK and food drink exports. Incredible to think of those 99 million cases of whisky, all distilled and bottled using traditional methods by crinkly-eyed old Scotsmen with wiry forearms and plenty of intra-leg ventilation. Incredible and woefully inaccurate, of course. Most of it is mass-produced in factories. But the Scots trade very successfully on the heritage of their product, and quite right too. I always like to know what I should be picturing when I close my eyes and savour a single malt. And it isn't a sales graph in the head office of Diageo. For that privilege, we pay £329 each per year in tax to the Exchequer, who subsequently get their round in the form of police, A&E and Trident to keep us safe while we sleep it off. 57% of the cost of a bottle of wine is tax, which is why I make sure I only drink the top half. But of course, there is an economic hangover associated with all this fiscal merriment, and it's vicious. Alcohol-related harm is now estimated to cost society £21 billion annually in England alone, and this figure is made up. Sorry, this figure... This figure is made up of NHS costs, alcohol-related crime and lost productivity due to alcohol, though it doesn't even cover the financial ramifications of getting drunk and waking up in Las Vegas married to a blackjack dealer called Amber. The overall cost to the NHS alone is £3.5 billion, and alcohol is one of Britain's 3 biggest lifestyle risk factors for disease and death after smoking and onesies, or more technically obesity, though I would argue that correlation in this case does equal causation. Worldwide, meanwhile, alcohol-related premature deaths account for 3 million a year, more than measles, malaria and men in balaclavas combined. So what is it that blurs our vision when we examine our glasses for traces of guilt? Follow the money is this show's default position, and to help me find out where it's going, and frankly whether we can get a slice of it, is our in-house economist. Please welcome from Radio 4's More or Less, the man with the golden calculator, Tim Harford. Tim, are economists fond of a drink? Is it a drinking profession?
We're not actually famous as party animals. The saying goes that when the economics conference arrives in town, all the hookers take the week off.
Obviously, it's quite easy, as I did earlier, to enumerate the costs of alcohol to society, but it's harder to economically assess the benefits it brings.
It's tricky for economists because we always assume that if you've bought something, or you've bought that hamburger, you've bought that holiday, you've bought that book, it must have given you some pleasure, it must have been worth it for you. But once you get to harmful and addictive substances, and alcohol's certainly one of those, it gets much more tricky to still assume that people are acting rationally, and we're not so good at that.
It's very difficult because this is a product that's been in society for a very long time. Alcohol has been around, I mean, in the case of a bottle of limoncello in our larder, about 23 years. Even the cleaner won't touch it. But it's mentioned, of course, in the Bible. Noah celebrates hitting dry land by getting drunk in his own vineyard. Jesus' first miracle was to turn water into wine at the wedding of Cana, which is surely, I think, a ringing endorsement of alcohol's ability to make even weddings endurable. And broadly speaking, a sign that God is clearly pro-booze. He gave us grapes. And then the Romans came at one point with their wine.
They did. They discovered this massive economic benefit of wine, which is while you're subjugating peoples across an enormous empire, you can sort of get them to view you in a favourable light by supplying them with Chianti. And
right.
They pay their taxes and they're perfectly happy. If you can grow grapes, then you make wine.
We don't have grapes in this country, of course, so we have what?
So we were forced to resort to apples and cider, which is okay, honey, mead, and then, thank goodness, we eventually discovered how to make beer.
Beer, absolutely, because cider is far too easily drunk by children without wincing, and very fair to say as well, and this is important, it was for centuries, again around the world, the only safe way to drink anything at all. Water could often be contaminated, but small beer, as it was called, which is only about 2 or 3% alcohol, was actually safer than fresh water and was the main thing that was drunk. Labourers would drink 10 or 12 pints of the stuff over the course of a day just to slake their thirst. How very different from modern Britain. But the fact is, people live their whole lives ever so slightly sozzled. And the economic advantages of this, I would say, were massive because life was rubbish for everyone back then, and this got them through it. And the British wobbled happily through many centuries on 2 or 3% alcohol, this kind of small beer, before the first spirits began to appear. I believe they came over with William of Orange from Holland. Is that right?
Yeah, hence the term Dutch courage, because the Dutch invented gin. And William was in favour of gin. William is trying to suck up to Parliament, all the parliamentarians, own land, and will profit from a rise in the price of grain. So 2 birds with 1 stone. You ban the import of French brandy, and you encourage the British to distill their own bathtub gin from British grain, and grain prices go up. What could possibly go wrong with that? I have an account here of the time. An eyewitness wrote, "The whole town of London swarmed with drunken people from morning until night." It was so appalling that the Daily Mail apparently was set up in order to be appalled by it.
Now, you may be looking at your post-work glass of wine and thinking, oh, come on, it's not that bad. And you're probably right, unless you're listening to this in your car, in which case you should definitely switch to a hip flask. It's much less detectable in a moving vehicle than a glass of Rioja sloshing about every time you try to answer the phone. That's just a little personal tip, not BBC endorsed. We've seen that alcohol is one of the leading causes of premature death and has brought one of the world's greatest cities to its knees. So the question is, how is alcohol still allowed to walk the streets, twirling its cane and tipping its hat to small children and scandalised ladies, while these other pharmaceutical ne'er-do-wells must skulk in the shadows and profit the criminal rather than the licensed trade and the exchequer? To get to the bottom of this, I met David Nutt, world-renowned professor of neuropsychopharmacology. Try saying that after a few pina coladas at the World Science Expo. He was famously sacked from the government's advisory council on the misuse of drugs after he said that alcohol was more harmful to society than LSD, cannabis or ecstasy. He was clearly right, to be fair. The only threat ecstasy users present to society is unwanted sweaty hugs, gurning and Manchester. Even cocaine users offer very little danger to passers-by, at least if you don't actually have any tits to be bored off in the first place. I met David Nutt at a pub, which gradually emptied, bizarrely, as we went on. He ordered the Diet Coke and I gingerly looked at an untouched pint while he told me just how dangerous alcohol really is.
If we treated alcohol like we treat food additives, for instance, or food colorants, and we do proper toxicology testing and we say how much of this is safe to use in a year, the amount of alcohol you could drink in a year would be about 1 glass of wine. And that shows you the magnitude of the blinkers we put on ourselves, because we allow ourselves to drink 1,000 times more than the safe dose.
That is extraordinary, because I had seen it widely reported that a glass or two of red wine a night is better than nothing at all in terms of health.
Yeah, well, this is one of the wonderful pieces of misinformation that the drinks industry puts out. Alcohol overall is extremely damaging. There is no age in which alcohol consumption, either in men or women, it has a net benefit in our society. And alcohol in young people is particularly damaging. Alcohol is the leading cause of death in men between the ages of 16 and 50. And in another 10 years, it'll be the leading cause of death in women at that age, because it is so destructive in terms of the liver damage it causes and also the disinhibited behaviour and the accidents and the fights, etc.
But are you factoring in the ability to feel the love towards your fellow man, that kind of lovely warm feeling gathering around that?
That's the first pint, and then, of course, you start beating up your fellow man after the sixth pint.
Just as well he's on the Diet Coke. But why is it still then so popular? I wonder, because is it about money? I'd always assumed the reason that alcohol is allowed to remain in our culture, protected by government, is that they get significant revenues from it themselves.
Well, this has always been the argument. And, of course, the revenue they get is a pretty immediate revenue. So it's a steady influx of maybe 10, 12 billion pounds a year into the Treasury. The problem is that the costs of alcohol outweigh the benefits. Certainly, if you look at the cost to policing in Britain, now that's estimated up to about 8 billion a year. The health costs about 4 billion.
Sorry, are you saying 8 billion of policing specifically to deal with drugs?
To deal with alcohol, yeah. Well, it's the social disorder on our streets on Friday and Saturday nights is so enormous. Yes, it costs between 6 and 8 billion a year to police drunkenness.
And I should clarify, when Professor Nutt says to police drunkenness, he means policing drunk people, not actual police drunkenness. Police drunkenness actually accounts for no more than a couple of billion a year, and that is mainly spent on donuts to soak up the hangover. So what I did want to know is what economic weapons we might have in our arsenal to help us cope with this flood of drunkenness.
We know what to do because another country called France, 30 years ago, did it right. They stopped all alcohol advertising. They reduced the drink driving limit to 50 milligrams %. We have 80. And they priced out, through minimum pricing, cheap wine. That reduced cirrhosis death rates in France to 20% of what they were 40 years ago. When I started in medicine, liver cirrhosis was the French disease, along with syphilis. Now, we have death rates from cirrhosis that are 3 times those of the French, and the Scots have death rates 6 times those of the French.
I think this is interesting because we have always accepted in this country that the French have this almost preternaturally balanced and healthy relationship with alcohol just because they're somehow more sophisticated and they start drinking at the age of 4 and they eat their meat and their beans separately and all this sort of nonsense. But actually it didn't just happen, it took legislation. Tim Harford, you've heard what David has to say about booze. To be fair, he is a neuropsychopharmacologist, possibly the only one in captivity. You are an economist. Do his suggestions for limiting the ravages of alcohol stand up as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think he's absolutely right that if you raise the price of booze, then people are going to drink less. That stands to reason, and we've also got good evidence on that. What's a bit strange, though, is this idea that we have of a minimum price for alcohol. That's really strange. So you can make Diamond White more expensive by saying there's a minimum price, or you can make Diamond White more expensive by putting more tax on it. And if you put tax on it, then the government gets the money and gets to spend it on public services. If you just put a minimum price on it, then the pubs or the supermarkets get the money. It's really strange. If they got together and they said, we're going to agree a minimum price for booze, they'd go to prison, and yet the politicians are suggesting that they introduce a law forcing them to do that.
We're not the only country that have struggled with this over the years. Who are the big drinkers?
It's disappointing, isn't it? No, the champions are all former Soviet Union countries. So
right.
The Soviet bloc had supplied 8 out of the current 10 top drinking nations.
Wow.
It's a real record to be proud of. So Russia in particular, they've been trying to control vodka in Russia for a very, very long time, and it's always been a bit tricky because vodka tax revenues, before there was oil and gas to prop up the Russian state, it was being propped up by tax on vodka. In the 19th century, it apparently accounted for over half of all state tax revenue.
That is a lot. So how are they dealing with it at the moment? I mean, where are they at?
Well, I think they're all still drunk. I mean, the most remarkable attempt, I think, came in the late 1980s. You may remember Mikhail Gorbachev with his policy of glasnost. As well as glasnost, he also had a policy of trying to promote sobriety, trying to get people to cut down on the drink. He did actually manage to reduce official vodka sales. Unfortunately, the sales of sugar surged, and by a fantastic coincidence, it turns out that sugar is the key ingredient of moonshine. In Russia, it's called samagon. So pretty soon, people were not only blind drunk, but actually literally blind and mad as well.
So in Russia, if they put the price up too high, people just start distilling their own spirits, essentially. That's the...
Yeah, and this is something that we found all over the place. So America famously tried prohibition. They didn't really get rid of alcohol, but they did encourage the mafia to set up. So it didn't really work out too well. I mean, there is this long-standing idea in economics of the bootleggers and the Baptists. So you ask yourself, who wants alcohol to be banned? And one group of people are the Baptists, because they're fine, upstanding citizens. They think alcohol is terrible. And the other people who want alcohol to be banned are the people who make illegal alcohol. People standing up for the regulation for ethical reasons, but also the people who would actually profit from the loopholes also want the regulation, because that's how they can make money.
That's interesting. Let's go and check. How are you doing, Andy? Can I just ask, you've had your wine. How are you getting on with the wine? You haven't made much of a dent in it, I have to say.
It doesn't taste very nice for a start.
Have one large gulp out of that and then move on to that craft beer that we've got sitting there. I'm a bit suspicious of the craft beers. I think craft has its place, usually in a market or something, you know, but I'm not sure beer should be made with love. I think know-how is more important, personally, but you have a glug of that, see how you get on. Now, there is one drink... Whoa! More craft went into the making of it than the pouring of it, by the way. There is one drink I won't be giving to Andy this evening after a long discussion with the producer, which is a shame, to be honest, because it's an entirely legal beverage that I've been... Could you stop upstaging me with your froth antics over there? It is a shame because it's an entirely legal beverage that I've long been intrigued by, and yet I am unwilling to sample myself. And I think it illustrates some of the economic imperatives that actually determine our consumption of alcohol. The drink in question is known by many names, particularly in the parts of Scotland where it's popular. Wreck the Hoose Juice, Commotion Lotion, and Cumbernauld Rocket Fuel. But its official title is Buckfast Tonic Wine. Shortened often to Bucky, and it's made and sold in Buckfast Abbey in Devon by monks. Now, these monks, played in your head by Bill Bailey or Derek Nimmo, depending on age, Basically, buy the cheapest red wine available from the continent's industrial drip trays and beef it up with what amounts to a highly caffeinated cough syrup. Bucky is then, in theory, sold up and down the country to those in need of a little pick-me-up before their evening meal, but is in practice mostly driven straight to the off-licences and supermarkets serving the less well-off parts of Lanarkshire, where it is widely held to be responsible for a substantial proportion of Scotland's violent crime, or certainly that which occurs within what is known as the Buckfast Triangle, which is a bit like the Bermuda Triangle, but instead of planes disappearing, it's entire weekends. And yet, despite the Church's long and distinguished history of campaigning against intemperance of any kind, the monks of Buckfast have taken a very selective vow of silence on the role their product plays north of the border. They have wound their sales pitch in a little lately. The label used to recommend 3 small glasses a day for good health and lively blood. So lively it often leaps entirely clear of your body and is found pooling in a gutter with several teeth bobbing about in it. However, the label now states the name tonic wine does not imply medicinal or health-giving properties and will surely lead soon to a label that simply reads, Buckfast tonic wine, do not drink. To paraphrase the National Rifle Association, Bucky doesn't kill people, people kill people. Especially people on Bucky. Except, of course, that Bucky does kill people too. It kills many of its users, as do all alcoholic beverages. Bucky and the other alcoholic drinks take the lives of incomparably more users than heroin, cocaine and every other illegal drug known to man combined. So, I'm sorry, Andy, we can't offer you any Bucky anyway. We just couldn't get the insurance. But I want to find out now how you're getting on economically. How do you feel about your job right now? How do you feel about the fact that you are a BBC wage slave?
I feel very warm.
Warm towards your employer, towards your colleagues?
Yeah, it's like a mixture of feeling quite chilled out but also nauseous. But yeah, I feel good about my job. This has been a good day at the office.
Yes, well, that's great. Sadly, I can tell you that due to your turning up to work drunk, you no longer have a job. I'm really... Zero tolerance at the BBC, I'm afraid. Still, you're in a good position to drown your sorrows. May I recommend the brandy? So... Andy there demonstrating the double-edged sword of alcohol, that the idea that it might be possible to enjoy the benefits of alcohol but avoid the pitfalls, such as being laid off, has long been cherished by mankind. But is that idea, that alcohol could ever be tamed, is that a complete fantasy? When I spoke to David Nutt, he told me that he's actually been working on a sort of synthetic substance which would have all the effects of alcohol but would also come with an antidote. And I don't mean a fry-up, I mean a real antidote. One which would return you to sobriety within an hour of your taking it.
We've identified many, many compounds that would be substitutes for alcohol, safe alternative drinks.
Are you even allowed to market them with caveats or even on prescription or anything at the moment?
Well, the position is very unclear. So my view is that we could actually sell a drink that was like alcohol perfectly legally. The problem is no one knows whether when one started doing that, the government would suddenly decide that they didn't like that and then would clamp down. So personally, I'd like to take the risk, but I need a bit of funding to do that.
So you've got the chemical, let's call it...
We call it Alcosynth.
Alcosynth. OK, sounds a bit 80s, but we'll go with it. Alcosynth. And that is, you already have the antidote. You could go to market with that right now, if you had the backing.
Absolutely. We have the product, we've tested it, we know it's like alcohol. We're ready to go, we just need investors.
What a perfect time, then, to talk to our series investment guru, Merryn Somerset-Webb, about the potential for investing in Alcosynth. Unfortunately, because she's the editor of Money Week, she lives the high life up in Edinburgh, and she can't be with us here in the studio. I can't remember the exact reason she gave. It was something about J.K. Rowling and some blood diamonds. So... Down the line to Edinburgh, I asked Merryn if she would invest in Alcosynth, as described to me by David Nutt.
Can you drive after you've taken the antidote?
Well, he says so. He says within an hour of taking the antidote, you're completely sober to all intents and purposes, yeah.
OK, well, in that case, yes, I think it's a very interesting investment opportunity, but I suspect there's some psychological issues with it. If we took something that gave us the effects without the after effects, we would be effectively admitting that we drink to get drunk rather than drinking because we like the taste of wine, which, of course, is what we all pretend, right? We like beer, so we drink beer because we like it.
People would resist the idea that they were socially hindered by their own personality.
Yes, I think so. And there's also the issue of, joy and suffering.
And joy and suffering are, if you're wondering, the names of Merryn's children. They're quite a traditional family in Scotland. But because of where she lives, Merryn is more excited than any Money Week journalist I've ever heard about the effect that Alcosynth would have there.
If you could drink a lot and then drive, I think this would be an absolute goer of a product, particularly in Scotland, where, there are new drink driving rules where you can barely drink a thing. And Scotland is full of frustrated drinkers at the moment. So I would launch this product first in Scotland.
And obviously there's
now.
OK, steady on, Merryn. Away from Alcosynth, I wondered whether there are any other areas where we might make money from alcohol.
You can go and look at the crowdfunding websites where you can invest in a niche gin company or a niche whiskey company.
But you certainly can. But would you recommend them? Are they proving to be profitable?
It's very early in the cycle for crowdfunding, so it's impossible to say yet. But generally, small companies fail, so probably not.
But if one takes off, you're in right at the bottom.
Well, exactly, and that's the way with investing in very small companies. If they do well, they do really well, but mostly they don't. But it's fun, and it's a lot more interesting.
Now,
Is it going to finance your pension? Probably not.
Good job. I've got my stash of vintage wines in the cellar then, ready to sell on in a few years' time when this Radio 4 gravy train pulls to a shuddering halt. I asked Merryn if it was worth investing in some more bottles of wine.
Investing in wine is great as long as prices go up. You're making a big assumption there, and we always say that nothing is an investment unless it's paying you an income. If it's paying you an income, then you can figure out what it's actually worth because you take the present value of the future streams of income and you say that's what this thing is worth today based on my forecast of the income it's going to produce. If it doesn't have an income, it's impossible to find what its correct value is at the moment. That makes it not really an investment but a hobby.
Well, I've already got a hobby that's detrimental to my health and doesn't guarantee much of an income, namely this series. So... what have we learned? We learned that 50% of a bottle of wine is tax, unless you get it from Tesco, in which case it's mostly old Ribena and food colouring. We've learned that if your street is plagued by hookers, maybe the best thing to do is host an economics conference. In the 18th century, gin probably didn't taste as nice as it does now, but it was much better for cleaning your paintbrushes. The Russians drink so much that it's possible that their incursion into Ukraine was just a drunk tank driver who'd thrown his sat-nav at a bouncer. And finally, LSD is less harmful to society than red wine and will make for a much punchier coq au vin. Thank you very much for listening. I've been Simon Evans. Thank you and good night. To Simon Evans Goes to Market, where I was joined by Tim Harford, Professor David Nutt and Merryn Somerset-Webb. It was written by me, Simon Evans, with Benjamin Partridge and Andy Walton and Guy Venables, and the producer was Claire Jones. It was a BBC Radio comedy production. Welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. Yes, thank you, and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market, a show about that thing that gets Evan Davis's heart racing. No, not backstreet bare-knuckle boxing, it's economics. This week's bad habit is tobacco. It's been called the single biggest avoidable cause of death in the world today, although that only works if you regard corruption, lies and stupidity as avoidable, which is moot, to say the least. It is the only legal product that will, like as not, kill you if used as advertised. That last bit is important, by the way, to distinguish it from cotton buds. So... yes, tobacco is morally tainted, but this is a show about economics, and in economic terms, tobacco has been the miracle of the age, of several ages, in fact. It got our boys through not one, but 2 world wars, in the instance of the second being a critical advantage in morale over the largely smoke-free Nazis, and was thus of incalculable economic benefit to the free world. The economic imperatives of resisting anti-tobacco legislation prompted huge leaps forward in public relations techniques and legal sophistry, and of course its increasing demonization in the latter part of the century triggered unexampled creativity in the advertising industry too. As a result, tobacco has been the single best performing stock of the last century. A single pound invested in tobacco shares in 1900 would now be worth over £6 million. Even allowing for the miracle of compound interest, that is not to be coughed at. And on top of all that, end users contribute hugely more than they otherwise would have done to the public coffers, and then cash out before drawing much of their state pension. Yet cigarettes are locked behind steel shutters in newsagents, while porn mags and Ginster's pasties remain on full view. Cigarette adverts have been not just stripped from billboards, but replaced with pictures of a cigarette oozing some sort of bloody organic matter that, in Hove, at least looked uncannily like the McDonald's McRib, which was pictured just below it. How's that for gratitude? And how can it possibly be that tobacco is not celebrated on every corner? Let's find out. Please welcome one of the most patient economists in broadcasting. He's funny, he's insightful, he's well-informed, and more to the point, he's currently on the Radio 4 payroll and was a deal breaker for the network. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Harford. Now, how has the last year gone for you?
It's very kind of you to ask, Simon. I've been busy. I've been writing my weekly columns for the Financial Times. I've won a writing prize. I've published a book, fact-checking the statistics during the general election campaign.
Okay, anyway, fine. Well, listen, welcome back to my radio show. Just as a general overview, what do you make of my plea for a little more tolerance for tobacco?
Simon, it reminded me of a report that was commissioned by Philip Morris, a big tobacco company, for the Czech government. And this report has become quite notorious. They tried to figure out how much money smoking was saving the Czech government. And when you think about it, you realise smoking is actually a great deal for the government because it saves you pensions, nursing home costs, treatment for all kinds of expensive conditions such as dementia. Smokers die of heart attacks. It's pretty cheap. And so they came up with the fact that the Czech Republic had saved £103 million in 1999, all thanks to the wonderful cigarette.
And the other thing is, of course, about tobacco is that it's very hard to assess the amount of enjoyment it brings, particularly to the lower paid worker. Who knows how many menial jobs would not be done with the relish and enthusiasm that they... if somebody didn't have their cigarette break to look forward to, not to mention the opportunity to stand outside the building premises where they work and watch the world go by.
Yeah, there is actually a research paper called Do Cigarette Taxes Make Smokers Happier? So, obviously, if you smoke, then you don't want cigarettes to be expensive, unless you're trying to quit, in which case you do want cigarettes to be expensive because that might help you quit. So these two quite respected economists did all this statistical analysis and to try to answer this question, do cigarette taxes actually make smokers happier?
And what was their conclusion?
Yes, they do.
They really do. We're going to explore this from a number of angles over the course of the show, but to help us explore the economic impacts of these various products in real time, we've also secured the services of a show guinea pig, a blank human slate who is a stranger to each and every one of these addictions. This was an idea I got from Channel 4. Probably the only one ever. They made headlines you may have seen by making newsreader Jon Snow take so-called skunk marijuana and then have a brain scan, because that's, of course, what you normally fancy doing when you're high as a kite for the first time. And bizarrely, it freaked him right out. The viewers seem to buy this as a legitimate contribution to the legalisation debate, so we thought we'd do the same. Please welcome our very own ingenue, Andy. Before we go ahead, can I just check? You've never smoked any cigarettes, no tobacco in your life, no?
I've never smoked a single cigarette. I've had smoked salmon, and that is the closest we get.
There's a similar sort of skill in getting the cellophane off than there is in opening a packet of cigarettes, but at that point they part company. So, Andy, I have here we are. I have here your very own packet of 10, which the BBC have invested in a pack of 10. We're going to charge you 50p a cigarette just to keep it economically accurate. Okay, so that's roughly appropriate, and you get the lighter for free. They're 12 for a quid down the road if you decide to take it up after this evening. It's possible. That pack, you will notice, very little branding, just a close-up photograph of some diseased teeth and a warning that smoking gives you a life expectancy rarely seen outside of Game of Thrones. As indeed is Jon Snow in my household, at any rate. But You don't have to smoke the whole packet. I think over the course of the half hour, 3 ought to do it, and that will statistically only wipe half an hour off the end of your life. Probably a half hour you would otherwise have spent thinking a nurse was trying to steal your clothes. So it's no great loss. Now, I can see you've got on a nice knitted Christmas sweater there, which is a good decision, because normally we would allow you to sit in here and enjoy your vice for the evening, but rules are rules, I'm afraid, so it's out into the street for you. Thanks, Andy. Round of applause for Andy as he goes off. I am loving the frisson of giving a man a cigarette to smoke for the first time, the danger implicit in that. It's bizarre how things have changed. Really, of course, nowadays, very few Radio 4 listeners would light up except to create the right ambience for a front row special on French cinema. But that has all happened in most of our lifetimes. Not long ago, you could smoke in this very theatre. Some famous radio shows had actors actually lighting up. Hancock's Half Hour, of course, wouldn't have been the same without the emphysema. No product's presence in public life has diminished so rapidly. 30 years ago, you could smoke on trains, in buses, in planes, in schools, and if not in your children, then at very least while they were still in you. People smoked at the dinner table. If someone was still eating, it was considered polite but not obligatory to ask if you could light up, and it was far more rude to say, I'd rather you didn't, actually, which was always a bit like when you ask someone how they are and they actually go ahead and tell you. But now, as I discovered recently, if you walk into a hotel reception in, say, Dubai, and you see someone perfectly legally smoking in there, it's so shocking they might as well have squatted down and curled one out on the marble. Something that I can confirm will attract the attention of the concierge. So things have changed. Few things, Tim, have found their public image corrode so fast as tobacco.
Well, I guess with the possible exception of asbestos and casual racism.
Yes.
But I think
the unholy trinity. The thing was, tobacco, as you're probably aware, Tim, was smoked for centuries. It was smoked for countless centuries before the part of the world that counts, namely us, actually discovered it. That was only in the early 1500s. The French, typically enough, went for it first. Nicotine owes its name, not as you might think to an Irishman, but in fact to an early French importer, Jean Nicot, and like all filthy habits, of course, it soon spread from France to England via sailors, who are also responsible for us kissing with tongues, taking unauthorised leave, and polishing our coffee tables. Elizabeth I became a big fan, and I don't just mean that's what she looked like in those neck ruffs. She was actually very keen on a smoke. As the Virgin Queen, of course, she can hardly have experienced it in its most satisfying context, but more importantly for our remit, tobacco quickly became economically important. It made the New World colonies economically viable. It wasn't the only crop grown in Virginia, but it was so lucrative that farmers had to be forced by law to grow at least 1 acre of corn for every 3 of tobacco, lest they all starve. So, Tim, it was an opportunity to make money out of colonizing the New World. I mean, would that be fair to say in those days it was a force for good?
It was a force for colonial expansion, which you might say is a force for good, but not everyone would agree. I mean, the trouble with tobacco, it made money, but it was hard work to make it work as a crop. It was still quite cheap. And so what you really needed to make the economics work out was cheap labour. And we know where the American South got cheap labour. It was slavery. And there was this sort of vicious spiral of the more money you made growing tobacco, the more money you had to spend on slaves, so you bought slaves, and then you could grow more tobacco and make more money, and on until eventually Abraham Lincoln put an end to it.
Now, let's find out how Andy is getting on. He should be outside now, but through the miracle of mobile telephony, I'm hoping we'll be able to speak to him. Andy, are you there?
Hello, Simon.
Have you managed to have a cigarette yet?
I've smoked 2. The first one made me feel a bit sick. The second one went down quite a bit more easily. I feel a bit more alert, a bit more relaxed, slimmer, a bit more confident with the women.
OK, interesting. And economically, you smoked 2?
Well, economically, I'm a pound down. But I did offer a cigarette to someone who came out to make a phone call, and we got chatting, and we're going to share a cab home later, so that saved me a tenner. Maybe you should invite me in for coffee, you never know.
Well, I'm afraid you can't have that coffee, Andy, until the appropriate episode next week, but
spot.
I'm glad you're having a good time. This is fun. It's funny, I can sense the audience's unease that I've made a young man smoke. He's not a child, I should emphasise. For those of you at home who can't see him, he's nearly 18. And traditionally, of course, he is in fact a bit of a late starter, cigarette-wise, by their own admission. If only in internal emails, tobacco companies like people to start a fair bit earlier than that, preferably around 12. Still, BBC Chief stood firm on that one, so here we are. But Tim, Andy is reporting enjoying many of the benefits that people associated with tobacco in the 20th century, at least before the grisly health truth emerged. He feels alert, relaxed, sociable, successful with women.
Yeah, people used to like cigarettes, and of course, before the health trouble emerged, they were very popular, and they caught on really quickly. And that wasn't just a cultural thing, that was also a technological thing. So there was this huge breakthrough, which was the invention of a cigarette-making machine by James Bonsack. And James Bonsack developed this in 1890, and virtually overnight, the speed at which you could manufacture a cigarette increased 12-fold. And then you have a problem, because you've got all of these cigarettes and you need to shift them. So suddenly, big tobacco is trying to market the heck out of cigarettes and get people to smoke more.
Well, this is my point. So tobacco has driven huge innovations in the marketing industry. It's never given the credit for this. It would also be harsh not to remember the living conditions, even in America and certainly in Europe at that time, were still, the beginning of the 20th century, life was still tough. Cigarettes were definitely useful during the First World War. There's all kinds of accounts of the extent of the popularity of tobacco, the extent to which it lifted morale.
Yeah, it was a comfort. I think Lucky Strikes were particularly popular.
I've always enjoyed it because there can't have been anything much less lucky than striking a match 20 yards from a German sniper. I remember Saki, a very funny author, was actually killed in a trench, and apparently his last words famously were, "Put that bloody cigarette out," which is sad and unfortunate and also annoying given that his name was Saki. I always thought it'd be better if he went, "Oh, smoking in a trench, that's a good idea, I don't think." Never mind.
But eventually people figured out that there was a problem. It took them a while. So after the cigarette caught on, then you got the increase in lung cancer rates. So lung cancer rates are soaring in the 1930s. And for years and years, no one can work out why. So you've got these doctors tugging contemplatively on a camel, just trying to think, what could possibly be causing the rise in cancer? And they blamed the spread of the automobile. Actually, they blamed in particular the fact that roads were being tarmacked. Maybe that's what was making people sick.
It's sad, actually, that they didn't have UKIP in those days, because they could have blamed it on a wide variety of more imaginative solutions, couldn't they? Particularly, of course, at that time, the emancipation of women, which, if they had blamed it on that, they would actually have had a point. The emancipation of women was to blame for many millions of cases of lung cancer, tragically, insofar as the tobacco industry used the banner Torches of Freedom to flog cigarettes to the newly independent sex. They sold millions and millions and millions more cigarettes under this banner, Torches of Freedom. Come on, those were the days, weren't they? Come on. The industry it has since emerged, of course, aware of the links between smoking and cancer and of the addictive nature of nicotine for decades before they admitted as much, and as a result, they were eventually sued at the end of the last century for a little over $200 billion, comfortably the largest settlement ever agreed in an American court of law. But in the 1980s, at the very latest, the general public was surely aware that fags were bad for them. They were still smoking like chimneys. Is there any economic explanation for this kind of crazy addictive behaviour?
There were two Nobel Prize winners who have views on addiction, and actually they're contrary views. So there's Gary Becker. Gary Becker died recently, famously had this theory of rational addiction. So let me give you an example. Imagine, Simon, that you are fond of curry from your local curry house. And at the end of the year, they're going to double all their prices. So then the question is, well, what should you do now? If you merely like the curry, then you should eat more curry now, because it will get more expensive at the end of the year. But if you're addicted to curry, then perhaps you should start cutting down on the curry now, because every curry you have now will deepen your addiction and will make it harder to quit once it becomes expensive. So the prediction of the rational addiction theory is that when there's a price rise in the future, people actually cut down in the present. And it turns out that that's what the data show. So if the government's going to raise cigarette taxes, people will cut down now, similarly with other addictive substances.
And another Nobel Prize winner, Thomas Schelling, he lit up a cigar in a London restaurant in 1958 and spent the next decade and a half trying to quit, and said to me once, Gary Becker doesn't know what he's talking about with rational addiction.
I thought I'd ask an expert, no offence, Tim, but I went to meet Robert West, who is Professor of Health Psychology and Director of Tobacco Studies, Cancer Research UK Health Behaviour Unit, Department of Epidemiology and Public Health, University College London. Now, we only had the studio for an hour, and by the time he told me his job title, we were running short on time. So I jumped straight in and asked if the tax from the purchase of cigarettes offset the health costs of smoking to the NHS.
The interesting thing about the cost of the NHS, of course, is that most of the cost is at the end of life. And we're all going to die, unfortunately. And so the question is, for that, do smokers die more expensively than non-smokers? And the answer to that is we don't really know. So if we can delay people dying by getting them to stop smoking, we can put that cost off, maybe 20 or 30 years. But sooner or later, it's going to catch up with us. When it comes to the cost to society, it's a different matter because there's a lot of costs that are completely avoidable. For example, days off work through chronic illness or even minor illness, time off work for smoking breaks and things like that, cost of fires, for example. So these all mount up and they're completely avoidable. Anyway, when you take the whole lot together, then the cost to society is greater than the amount of money that the government gets in taxation.
So there we are, Tim. It's actually the smoking breaks which really cost society. Good news for animal rights campaigners, though. Those beagles are going to bankrupt the vivisection industry. But do smokers work harder the rest of the time? I asked the professor whether smoking enhanced any cognitive abilities at all.
I did a study back in the 1980s in which we found that nicotine increased the rate at which you could tap your finger on a keyboard. It was a very remarkable experience, but there are very few areas of life where you need to have that tapping speed.
There speaks a man who's never played Daley Thompson's Decathlon on the ZX Spectrum. I then asked him what the smoking picture is like around the world, starting with America.
What's happening in America is a very interesting experiment. They've decided that it's worth looking into the idea of taking the nicotine out of cigarettes almost entirely, because it will mean that people are not dependent on them, and so people will stop smoking them. And that is within the gift of Congress to do that. They can't eliminate it entirely, but they can get it down to a level, they believe, where it won't be addictive. And the results that are coming out are a little surprising. Blow me down. People will carry on smoking them. But why then will they carry on smoking a cigarette that's got almost no nicotine in it? It may well be that that's enough through conditioning processes, sort of Pavlovian response, to keep the addiction going. It's also a possibility that the brain has learnt the association between smoking the cigarette and getting the nicotine, that it would take years for it to disappear once you stop putting the nicotine into the cigarette. We just don't know.
I have to say, you can't expect Americans to notice nicotine is missing from their cigarettes when they haven't even noticed their food no longer contains food. What about big tobacco's great hope for future markets, however, which is, of course, the developing world?
The big problem that I can see is with women smoking, because in countries like the UK, the rates of smoking among men and women are broadly similar. In countries such as China, for example, you've got 60% of men smoking, 2.5% of women. Now, as they become westernized, as the tobacco industries get their teeth into these countries, what's to stop this going up? It's going to take something pretty serious on the part of governments to prevent that pressure, that economic pressure, from causing what would be a health catastrophe. So I think the developing world is going to have to watch out.
Tim, shouldn't we just throttle the product to death with really high taxation now? What is the argument against just doubling the price of a packet of cigarettes overnight and just putting an end to it?
Most of the money that people spend on cigarettes is already taxed. Now, I would be all in favour of raising taxes, but there's got to be a limit as to how much you can do it, given that the fundamental product is so cheap, before people find some other source of supply, for example, France.
Ah, right. So it's Europe is the problem, as usual, is it? Is that a fact? If we were out of Europe and we didn't have the opportunity to take a booze cruise ferry and come back laden up with cheap ciggies, would we be in a better position to tax the thing out of existence?
It would probably help a little bit, but last time I looked, Afghanistan was not in the EU, and we still seem to have heroin. So.
Yeah. If taxes went up, would people eventually stop smoking?
Well, there was a famous study of what happened when the Australian government announced that it was going to abolish inheritance tax, so that if you died after the 1st of January, then your estate was completely free of inheritance tax. And economists looked at this and they found that the death rate in late December fell. People actually postponed their deaths until the new year when they were tax-free.
Interesting stuff. Now, we're going to hear from Andy, but I understand he forgot to take his pass out with him, and the security at the BBC, being slightly to the right of Judge Dredd, won't let him back in, so... Oh, well, he's got a pack of fags to get him through the night. Still, smoking is certainly on the decline now in the developed world. With that in mind, I spoke to the editor of Money Week, Merryn's Somerset-Webb, to find out whether it's still worth investing in tobacco, given that historically the stocks have performed incredibly well.
You're absolutely right that this has been extraordinary. Last 100 years, 115 years, tobacco sector has returned 14% a year, which, given that the average for the market is more like 6, is absolutely amazing. And that's particularly given the headwinds, these huge settlements they've paid out, enormous amounts of regulation, very limited on how they can market, how they can advertise, how they can manage their brands, all this kind of thing, the health implications. But nonetheless, they've kept being this stunningly good investment. And even now, you ask the big fund managers where they're investing to get income, they'll always tell you tobacco. Go to British American Tobacco, now you can get a dividend of over 4%. It's fantastic.
But what about ethical concerns? Should that give us pause when we think about investing?
Well, by not investing in it, it's not that you make any difference. I think that's one of the key points to take on board. If a big listed tobacco company already has all the capital it needs, so when you're buying the shares, you're just buying a share, you're not injecting new capital. So whether you buy it or not is entirely by the by to the success of the industry. The only difference would be if they wanted to raise new capital, which generally they don't because they don't have cash problems. So there's that side to it. Whether you do or don't doesn't really make any difference. And of course, the more money you make in your investments, the more you may be able to give to charity or invest in social enterprises or whatever in a different way. The fact remains that however you cut it, it is the sin stocks that have performed well historically. There's a fund in the US, the Vice Fund, that has outperformed pretty much everything else, and it's certainly outperformed any social index funds you might look at. If you want to make money, you have to put what you might think to be your ethics to one side. Well, you don't have to, but you might make more money if you were to.
And I have to tell you, after Merryn said that, she sat back in her chair, winked and put her cigar out on a passing child. But is tobacco the goose that will continue to lay the addictive and lucrative egg? Is the cigarette money train going to keep rolling forever?
I am pretty sure that over the next 20 years, tobacco will be a bad place to be. From here on, I think we need to look at it in terms of not ethics, but sustainability. Is this a sector that can survive as it has over the last 30 years, over the next 30? I don't think so.
So cigarettes might not be a guaranteed good investment forever. What about vaping then? Could that prop up the old tobacco companies?
Vaping, I'm not sure that's going to take off. Why do people take up smoking in the first place? Because it looks kind of cool, or it used to look kind of cool, and vaping just doesn't have that. So why would you start? It's a method, I think, to give up rather than to start. So I don't think there's that much future in that, because if people don't start, they don't need to give up.
Well, there we have it. 2 thumbs down from Merryn. Just time to catch up with Andy one last time. And I'm being told that he has contracted pneumonia and died. Well... Obviously, that's a tragedy for him and his family, but on the plus side, the BBC will save on repeat fees for the show, and as licence fee payers, that's money in your pocket. The decisive moment for smoking in this country came in 1994 with the death of one of the nation's favourite all-round entertainers. According to industry experts, this was when the game was finally up. This cheerful, innocent man, beloved by millions, was brought down, so he at least believed, by second-hand smoke, and that became became the argument that was deployed so effectively to shove tobacco out of public life once and for all. Whether he knew it or not, his death was perhaps his last great achievement, costing big tobacco more than any other one British death has ever cost any one industry, and maybe saving more British lives in the process. So while tobacco has been the record-breaking investment and the record-breaking killer of the last 100 years, ultimately it is Roy Castle who was the real road to health paving, life-saving, no longer craving, better behaving, unenslaving record breaker! So, what have we learned? E-cigarettes are a high-tech alternative to tobacco, and not what people from Yorkshire say when they fancy a smoke. 30 years ago, you could smoke on trains, which was still marginally more healthy than eating one of the sandwiches. The Nazis smoked less than the Brits, so while they lost the war, most of them will have lived longer than our boys, showing you can never truly beat the Germans. And remember, if you must smoke, remember to wear a coat. Good night! You've been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market, where I was joined by Tim Harford, Professor Robert West and Merryn Somerset-Webb. It was written by me, Simon Evans, with Benjamin Partridge, Andy Walton and Guy Venables, and the producer was Claire Jones. It was a BBC Radio comedy production. Welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. Hello and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market, the show that is all about economics. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking economics is dull. I mean, even Robert Peston seems to drift off in the middle of sentences and then wake up with a jolt towards the end. But even a cursory understanding of economics can help you see how the world works and could change your life. Markets are the most natural, unmediated expression of human nature there is. They're not always a pretty sight, characterized as they are by greed, cunning, and badly placed apostrophes. But if you understand them, you're halfway to understanding what's really going on in the world. And besides, I actually put an apostrophe into apostrophes then, and this is Radio 4. I grew up in St Albans, which is technically a cathedral city, but much more importantly, a market town. I mean, yes, a cathedral can save your soul, but a market can save you pounds on your weekly shop. On non-market days, the high street in St Albans was like a luge in summertime, just a bare concrete thoroughfare where you could still get your nose broken if you weren't careful. But on Wednesdays and Saturdays, it awoke as if from a coma. To this day, whenever I'm supposed to be away relaxing in the country, it's only when I get to the local market that my shoulders really drop. Market taverns are the best taverns, market squares are the best squares, and Market Harborough is the best Harborough. And if I feel that kind of enthusiasm for markets and I'm just a comedian, imagine how enthusiastic my co-host for this show must be. He's a Financial Times economist and presenter of Radio 4's More or Less. Please welcome the Sultan of Stats, Tim Harford. Now, Tim, I would like to picture you as a young lad being led through market stalls by your mother and eagerly telling her that, look, mother, there is an oversupply of tomatoes and the price is falling accordingly. Was that where you first got the gist of how it works?
Actually, my mother used to take me to the supermarket, and I think in some ways, sad though it is, the supermarket might be a better microcosm of the modern world than the fruit and veg market, because rather than seeing supply and demand work in front of your eyes, you're participating in this sort of artificial game. The big corporation sets the rules. OK, you can go and shop elsewhere. But within that space, you're being manipulated, you're being watched, you're being spied upon, you're being offered choices that aren't really choices. And welcome to the 21st century. Really.
I was going to say, wow, but actually I can easily imagine you as a 7-year-old explaining all of that to your mother. And mother, you're being manipulated. manipulated, you do not see. Well, listen, in this series, we're not going to look at fruit and veg, but at some rather more addictive goods, namely alcohol, tobacco, sugar, and in this episode, coffee. Of course, as you all know, coffee is up in a cup, whether it be a single-shot tweaker in a beaker or a half-pint thug in a mug. It fuels Homo digitalis as surely as oil fuels his machines. It's fast challenging tea as this nation's favourite currently legal high. Sales of instant are up while sales of tea are down, and 85% of Britons visit a coffee shop at least once a week, many of them appearing to stay in there for very nearly that long as well. 1 in 5 people go to a coffee shop every single day, and they can't all just be using the loo. The cafe latte is now the nation's favourite drink, and popular though it is, we still lag well behind other European nations. The Germans drink roughly 3 times what we do, and the Finnish 5 times, which is presumably while they're finished. It's not just coffee shops either. Wetherspoon sells 1 million coffees a week now, even when it isn't in a special deal with a curry. Meanwhile, we're experiencing the blossoming of a trendy new coffee shop phenomenon, catering to bearded artisanal coffee snobs and their sophisticated Scandinavian boyfriends, in what is being described as the third wave of coffee. Clearly, serving coffee can harness helplessly habitual human activity to make a profit. But what I'd like to know is, are there deeper economic implications for this new coffee craze? Now, in order to bring the process to life, we've secured a human guinea pig for the series, so please welcome Andy. Incredibly, Andy here has no bad habits whatsoever and therefore has developed no tolerance to any of the substances we're investigating. He's like a real-life Inca or Aztec or Catholic. He's also one of the writers on this show, which is why I thought it would be hilarious to try and sabotage him with strong psychoactive chemicals. It's a bit like that experiment when NASA gave spiders different drugs to see what it would do to their webs. I don't know if you remember this, it was a few years ago now, but the spiders on LSD made terrific ornate webs with very interesting patterns. Spiders on ecstasy made strangely repetitive webs. And those on cannabis didn't actually bother making webs, they just went to get some flies from an all-night garage. The spiders on caffeine, however, and this bit is true, made the worst, most incoherent webs of all. And that, Andy, is what we're going to do to you. It is also, I should warn you, fiendishly addictive, though in my experience, giving it up is easy enough as long as you have 3 clear days without deadlines and no need to interact with other members of humanity. Especially not your own children. Do you have children?
I do not.
OK, you're probably all right. And you've never tried coffee before?
I've never had a coffee. I've never let it pass my lips. I quite like tiramisu.
Well, I think that we can count that as a no. Can I just ask, sorry, something is puzzling me. If you've never had coffee and you are a young person, relatively speaking, what is it when you've been on a date? What do you go in for when you actually want to have sex?
I'm a comedy writer, so that doesn't really come up very often.
OK, fine, all right. Well, you can take this one back with you. This is a thick, flat white, apparently, the closest thing to a tiramisu in a cup.
Can you draw something in the top? I've seen when you go to a coffee shop, people draw things in the top.
Oh, OK, hang on. OK. You neck that. We'll leave you there. You've got your notepad, you've got your pencil. Let's see if you can turn your life around, or at least keep your job. Now, a new book out entitled The Flat White Economy suggests that independent third-wave coffee shops are the visible tip of a whole new digital economy iceberg, whose importance is easily missed and greatly underestimated. There is more here going on than coffee, Tim, this whole new economy.
There is a really interesting point that gets made, so for example by the writer Stephen Johnson, which is that the coffee shop itself, it's not just the caffeine, but the ambience of the coffee shop is a hub of innovation. People are talking to each other, they're swapping ideas, they're talking very fast, of course, they're very excited. And so ideas spread. There's the phrase, ideas have sex with each other and beget new ideas in a coffee shop. So my favourite example, 1957, Sputnik is launched. A few physicists in Maryland in the United States start talking about Sputnik, and then they invent the idea of global positioning satellites. Where did it come from? Where were they having that conversation? In a coffee shop.
I don't know if you're aware of the Hungarian maths genius Paul Erdős, who used to say that a mathematician was a machine for turning coffee into theorems, although he used to spice it up a bit with Benzedrine as well, I believe. But he really was ahead of his time. If you look at the new economy really amounts to now, virtually every new profession of the last 30 years, software engineers, web designers, app developers, they're just machines for turning coffee into marketable commodities. And it really does seem to me this little insidious black liquid from the souks of Arabia is the one ancient analog ingredient without which the high-tech world cannot function. It's an odd balance. But listen, what about the plant itself? Incredibly, given the range of options available in stores today, you may be surprised to learn there are actually only two basic plants that all the world's coffee comes from. They're called Arabica and Robusta. Now, Robusta or Robusta is the less complex flavour-wise and has something of a bitter aftertaste, but it grows anywhere and has a kick like a mule. Arabica, on the other hand, is subtle and entrancing in the mouth, but temperamental in the soil. I like to imagine them as two characters in an old Jilly Cooper book about a girl's boarding school. Robusta is the one with the thickish ankles and the can-do attitude. Arabica, tiny feet, fluttering lashes. Sorry to be a nuisance, but she simply has to sleep precisely 11 feet from the window. Would you be ever so sweet and bring me the lavender oil from my valise? Margaret Rutherford and Audrey Hepburn, if you will, or you can update references to taste. But Vietnam, now second only to Brazil as a producer of coffee, grows Robusta in abundance. And while their trophy shelf may remain bare, they are also rarely visited by earnest small-batch roasters from Hoxton. So, swings and roundabouts. Arabica, on the other hand, is the business-class brew, and it can get furiously expensive, right up to the Kopi Luwak or civet coffee, which is famously passed through the digestive tract of a mongoose before being roasted. Now, there really is a machine for turning coffee into shit. Very fine and dainty. Robusta, on the other hand, gets on with the task of waking up the nation's nurses and cab drivers every morning and never gets so much as an Instagram of thanks. So it goes. Despite there being only these two plants which supply all the world's coffee, there are now a myriad, a dazzling variety of what are known as varietals, which now exist and which are used to inspire debate among connoisseurs. I wanted to find out a little bit more about this, so I went to the London Coffee Festival. I spoke to Oni Loisel and Michael Cleland, two purveyors of specialty coffee from Assembly Coffee, about where all these miraculous tastes come from.
This is based on the idea that coffees possess unique characteristics, not unlike the way that wines do, because of the impact of their provenance and the variety of the coffee itself and the way it's been processed.
And seriously, how many British customers do you think are capable of distinguishing between different coffees to that extent? I mean, even between Arabica and Robusta derivations.
This is a very exciting time. Specialty coffee in London has been a growth market now for 5-7 years, and it is exponentially exploding, as we can see in the cafe culture that's developing, and everyone's opening cafes and coming to understand a lot more about the product that they're working with. In terms of the consumer, I think today, compared to 5 years ago, people are now becoming more familiar with origin as a whole in terms of the kind of coffees that they like, be it those deep, full-bodied chocolate caramel profiles, which typically would be found in South Central America, or the more developed, more discerning coffee drinker, they potentially would enjoy the brighter, more floral notes, and they are coming to understand today that those coffees are grown in Africa.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Only 40 years ago, Monty Python could get big laughs by mocking the Australian wine industry, and now we can hear an Australian talking about coffee having floral notes. Things are getting out of hand. However, I listened patiently, at least I looked that way, as I heard Oni tell me how he buys his floral note coffee direct from farmers.
It was by no means a commercial decision. We took out all of the middlemen. We stopped buying from cooperatives in the same area and built relationships with 17 farmers in Peru. It cost us a higher price, but we're safe in the knowledge that those farmers are receiving the majority of that purchase.
Now, this is interesting, Tim, because for a while we were all led to believe that fair trade was the last word in creating a level playing ground, but now it sounds that perhaps direct trade rather than fair trade. I don't know. Do you have any views on these mechanisms?
What many people want to do is to tip the person who grew the coffee for them. So you can tip the person who serves the coffee, but you can't tip the person who's working so hard to actually produce the bean. But how are you going to do that? You don't know who they are. They're on the other side of the world. So how do you send money that you're willing to donate, you feel has been hard-earned? And so that's where the whole fair trade movement came in. So fair trade is basically sending an inspector around the world to check that these people are actually being properly paid and they are working in good conditions. And so then you can put the label on the coffee. And the trouble is, it's actually pretty expensive to send inspectors around the world looking at coffee farms. So if you apply for fair trade certification, for example, that's 400 quid. Then the first audit, that's 1,000 quid. It's actually very expensive.
Beginning to sound a lot like FIFA, to be honest.
I wouldn't go quite that far, but it's certainly, there have been some economists who've done research on this, and they say, well, fair trade, it might be effective, it might be doing some good, but we can't be sure. And I think you've got to come to the same conclusion with direct trade. It sounds great, but all this stuff is very expensive. It's not easy to lift people out of poverty just using coffee.
And meanwhile, of course, we shouldn't be too dismissive of Robusta, because instant coffee is still massively big.
We should be dismissive of Robusta. Well, we should be dismissive of instant coffee. It's disgusting
I'm a grown-up.
stuff.
I don't like it either. I agree. It's a mockery. It survives the granulation process about as well as a lamb chop would do. But
you see, you and I, Simon, we are sophisticated people,
yeah.
but it turns out we're in a minority. So even in America, where you thought they are fond of drinking horrible processed drinks, instant coffee is only 7% of the coffee market. Here in the UK, 77%.
That is actually disgusting to me, because I have been doing some reading on this, and it turns out Americans are responsible for us drinking instant coffee. We'd never heard of the stuff until American GIs came here during the war, brought this with them as a sort of stopgap so that they could get coffee while they're over here, and we lap this stuff up. It's a very British mentality, though. Quite good enough for us, thank you very much. Just have the powdered instant, thank you. And meanwhile, as you say, the Americans have gone off, and the Italians, I believe, drink 1% of instant coffee, which
I can't believe it's as much as 1%.
No.
I mean, it's like if you were to serve Kenko or something to an Italian, that would be like a declaration of war. That would be...
I think what happens in this country is that many of us give up drinking instant coffee with rising disposable income, but then we often reintroduce ourselves to it as we discover the imperatives of the state pension. And indeed the declining ability of our ageing taste buds to tell the difference anyway, which is one of those happy coincidences. But something big did happen not that long ago. It seems now it's like many things like smartphones and digital cameras. The espresso revolution was only about 15 years ago. I remember in the late 1990s, espresso was only made in stovetop machines owned by self-unemployed communists who had managed to buy the rent book of a Clerkenwell council flat from a single mum they'd been briefly shacked up with and were now using it as a base for organising the revolution and selling knockoff Athena posters. That was where you would encounter espresso. Suddenly, it's become the cornerstone for any number of indulgent treats. And there's this growing sense that it's the only viable way to operate commercial premises at street level in much of urban Britain. I have to declare a bias at this point as far as coffee goes. I live in Brighton and Hove. Brighton is coffee ground zero, which is actually a slightly cleverer thing to say than you've probably realised. Coffee in Brighton is now, it's like Nokia was in the 90s. There are more coffee shops than people. We have the highest coffee consumption per capita in the UK, £177 per person per year, which is apparently £25 a head more than in London. It has become the lifeblood of the city, more so even than heroin and hen parties. It's extraordinary. Everywhere in Brighton now serves coffee, art galleries, barbershops, colonic irrigators, everywhere. And on the other hand, coffee shops now have expanded their offer to include live music and bicycle maintenance and yoga. And there's this seesaw. One of them is saying, why go to a coffee shop when you can have great coffee in an art gallery? Why go to an art gallery when you can see great art in our coffee shop? Why go to a tattoo parlour when someone in this record shop is so wired on coffee they'll have a go on you for free? And so we have reached a saturation, you would think, but I don't know. It just seems to spiral out of control. I want to know, is there any kind of precedent? The only thing I can think of was Douglas Adams' shoe event horizon in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where more and more shoe shops overwhelmed the high street and eventually the whole economy just collapsed. That's the only other example of this I've ever encountered.
If you go back to The Onion in the late 90s, they were already joking back then. They had an article that Starbucks was opening a cafe inside the toilet of another Starbucks. So you could get a latte while you were queuing to use the loo. But back then, there were 2,000 Starbucks. There are now 21,000 Starbucks. So it's 10 times as many Starbucks in America as there were. So it's weird. You've got to think that there must be some point at which this becomes completely unsustainable, but we keep going.
Is there some hidden dynamic where the more coffee shops there are, the more people will respond to them?
This is economics, so there's always a hidden dynamic. But it's a bit like when you go into the supermarket and you see, there are the Cheerios, and there's the cinnamon Cheerios, and the apple cinnamon Cheerios, and the protein cinnamon Cheerios, and the nut-free, and you realise the whole aisle is packed with all of these different varieties of Cheerios. And somebody who wants to launch a breakfast cereal, they can't do it because every possible niche is already filled. So the idea is it's the same with coffee shops. If Starbucks tries to scare away competitors, or Costa try to scare away competitors by lowering the price, well, people know the price could always go up again tomorrow. But if they try to scare away competitors by opening 5 coffee shops on one street, that is a credible threat. Nobody is going to go toe-to-toe against that. So it's an attempt to pack the market and make it impossible for competitors to get in there. But obviously, Brighton hasn't yet got the message.
I've got to say, I'm as sceptical about the whole choco-mochaccino thing as the next balding 50-something, but that's really not the point anymore. The espresso revolution has actually changed more than just the way we drink coffee. It has changed the way we use the high street. The coffee shop now is clearly, it's a hub. It's not just the coffee, it's not just the crying toddlers or the stylish black and white photos of geriatric Italian sex pests. It's the free Wi-Fi and the power sockets and the ambient creativity and the exchange of ideas, as you say. And most of all, it's a place where you might actually become one of your more cherished notions of yourself. And although they're selling an ancient brew, coffee shops, I think, are best understood economically alongside digital giants like Apple and Amazon and Google. In some cases, they even follow their tax strategies. I can never remember which one is avoiding and which one is evading. So let's just say Starbucks have been accused of shimmying past what might strike some as their fiscal obligations.
As the economist, I should say that it's perfectly legitimate what they're doing. I mean, I'm all in favour of us getting taxes from big American multinationals. That sounds like a great idea, but we've got to bear in mind they pay taxes on the income that they pay their staff, they pay taxes on the premises, they pay VAT on the stuff that they sell. So sure, it'd be nice to collect some profit tax as well, but if we have structured our tax system so as to make it entirely optional, we can't really blame them if they take the option.
And enough small businesses are being run out of Starbucks on a daily basis without them paying any overheads either, so I suppose that's fair enough. What are the economics of running a coffee shop?
You're always trying, as a coffee shop owner, to persuade the idiots who are willing to pay more to actually pay more. So you need to find something. So, OK, well, we'll offer the marshmallows. They cost like 3p, but we'll charge you an extra 50p for marshmallows. You want a little kind of squirt of that horrible, mucky cream, that's another 50p. And, certain people will come up and they will pay for the marshmallows, they'll pay for the cream, they keep paying. So that's the price discrimination.
One thing I want to know, let's say a latte is about £2.50 now, how much of that is actually going on coffee?
On the coffee beans, it's about 10 pence. You're probably paying more for the paper cup.
However, the relatively small portion of the price of your coffee that goes on the beans is actually very good news for coffee producers because it encourages them to focus on quality. If you think about it, if a sack of good coffee is $200, but a sack of OK coffee is just $100, well, then it sounds like a tempting bargain to get the cheap stuff. But if that price difference equates to just an extra 5 pence a cup for really good coffee, then suddenly the cheap stuff doesn't look so tempting because your customers won't come back, which means the high overall cost of your morning latte is in fact the surest way to make sure farmers are encouraged to follow best practices and produce the best beans. Consequently, the equation for the new artisanal coffee shops is not do we or don't we offer ethically sourced superior blends, but rather just how ethically sourced and superior can we go? It's time to see how our guinea pig is doing. Andy, you've had a couple of shots of the hard stuff, albeit in a deep, milky, drowned beverage. How are you feeling?
I feel quite alert. I feel quite sweaty. I'm very aware of my heart.
Well, you finished your latte. We've got a couple of espresso shots in here. This is a slightly more grown-up variant. Apparently this one comes with a caramel and chocolate syrup in, however, although to you it'll probably still taste like you've licked a rusty hinge. There you go.
Thanks.
You get that down your neck. Now, also to go with your order, there's flapjack there, a cookie the size of a child's face, one of those caramel discs you're supposed to put on top of the cup, a branded mug, a piece of local art that was hanging on the wall of the coffee shop, and a choice of an easy-listening bossa nova CD or the latest one by Paul McCartney. So that's the full experience for you right there.
Great.
And that'll be £240, please. But don't worry, you also get a stamp on your loyalty card. Only another 9 stamps and you'll have lost the card. So, we've demonstrated that coffee shops are big business and are likely to be here to stay. And we've also demonstrated, I think, that they are a fairly ethical economic phenomenon. But is there money that we can make as private investors? I spoke to Merryn Somerset-Webb, the editor of Money Week, and asked her, how do we invest? Should we be gambling perhaps on the price of coffee as a commodity?
Investing in the price directly is, I think, way too risky for ordinary investors, for the likes of us. But you could buy yourself a small coffee plantation. I saw a lovely little one in Costa Rica. It's only 9 acres, but it's got a gorgeous house with it, $645,000.
Do they tell you how much you can hope to earn from that?
Well, it tells you can how much coffee you can make, but of course it depends on whether you actually do that and the price you sell it at. I suspect that you're probably a lot better off using these little plantations for agritourism, which is very popular in Costa Rica. So you have a small farm attached to a house in which you do B&B or a small hotel or something like that. But Costa Rica is beautiful. I mean, if I was looking for a holiday house which happened to be attached to a coffee plantation, I think it would be on my list.
So there you have it. The answer, as so often in life, is to move to Costa Rica. But what if you don't want to move to Costa Rica? Maybe you'd miss Springwatch, or indeed Spring, or giving a fifth of your wages to a railway company.
The other way to invest in coffee in the UK is actually coffee shops. The GDP numbers that we had out last showed that the economy is currently basically being driven by coffee shops, by people going out to eat and going out to drink coffee. And I think that is something that really will continue.
How would you invest in those? The big chains, or?
The big chains, absolutely fine. When Wetherspoons has reported excellent results. And then you can invest in small coffee shops as well. Again, if you go onto the crowdfunding websites, you will find loads and loads and loads of small coffee shops looking for funding and financing. The small ones, can they last next to the big ones? Who can know? But it's kind of a fun investment.
So there you have it. Try crowdfunding and give your life savings to some hipsters so they can buy an old tandem to hang on the wall next to the espresso machine. But is the government missing a trick here? Coffee is an addictive substance, or at least it's highly habit-forming. Is there a reason they haven't sought to extract more revenue from the coffee boom?
There's not a good reason to tax coffee in particular, in that it's not bad for you, it doesn't do anything wrong, it's not cigarettes, it's not alcohol. People going out and drinking coffee together is a really good thing, something that should be encouraged by our tax system, not discouraged by it.
She is right, of course. Coffee is a good thing. Now, let's see if our guinea pig Andy agrees. Andy, how has the espresso gone down?
Oh, it's brilliant. I feel so productive. I mean, in the last 10 minutes alone, I've mentally reorganised my bookshelves at home. I've done my tax return. I've worked out who stole Shergar. I've watched 18 TED Talks. I've sketched out the plot to a 5-part novel series, and I've worked out what Labour needs to do to win back the electorate. It's amazing.
You shouldn't have any trouble sleeping next weekend. So, what have we learned? Italians don't drink instant coffee, preferring to take hours out of their working day to grind their own beans. Another piece of the puzzle that is the Eurozone crisis falls into place. Some of history's greatest ideas have been born in the coffee shop, making it even more surprising that no one in there has had the bright idea to clean the bloody toilets once in a while. If you've got 600,000 spare, you can buy a 9-acre coffee plantation in Costa Rica. Or for the same money, you can buy a bedsit in London and try and grow something in a window box. Coffee shops spend more on paper cups than they do on ingredients. So you think they'd be happier when I go in and glug it straight from the nozzle. But no. But mainly, the economics of coffee are good. Coffee is addictive, but it is benevolent. It's a great way to support your local high street, local culture, and make the world better for really hard-working families. Those in Colombia, Costa Rica, and Brazil. Bring a bit of South American zing to your life. Addiction is only bad if you need to give it up. And God willing, you never will. Thank you very much for listening. I've been Simon Evans. Thank you, and good night. listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market, where I was joined by Tim Harford, Ollie Loisel, Michael Cleland and Merryn Somerset-Webb. It was written by me, Simon Evans, with Benjamin Partridge, Andy Walton and Guy Venables, and the producer was Claire Jones. It was a BBC radio comedy production. Welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. Welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market, the nation's only intentionally funny show about economics, and I have to say intentionally to distinguish it from any TV show Robert Peston appears on with that new bohemian hairstyle of his. Economics is a glimpse into how our minds work, how our neighbours work, and even how our 18 personal Chinese wage slaves work, even if we'd really rather not know. This series, we're talking about the markets in addictive substances, and this week we've come to the cuckoo in the nest, and what a big fat cuckoo it is. Sugar. Sugar is not a drug, of course, except as a coded reference to heroin in certain old songs that balding Mojo readers will explain to you if you buy them a pint of old Twiggy. Sugar is not even a gateway drug, though if you eat enough of it, they might eventually have to put a gateway in the wall of your bedroom to get you out. But sugar does seem to be addictive. No one has ever eaten just one Malteser, have they? Trying to eat one Malteser is like trying to just do the first metre of a skydive. And it's beginning to look very nearly as dangerous too. We have long explained its dangers to children in terms of tooth decay. Don't eat too much sugar, we tell them. It'll make your teeth fall out, or in the case of my hyperactive little tykes, get knocked out. A risky argument, though, tooth decay, as there is a powerful incentive for children to loosen their teeth without delay. The Tooth Fairy provides kids with an opportunity to trade their own body parts long before they can open an eBay account of their own. If you tell kids that eating sweets will make their teeth fall out, all they hear is ringing cash registers. This is where economic understanding is your friend. Tell them that sugar will undermine the value of their teeth when they do fall out, and that the Tooth Fairy will no more pay for a sugar-decayed molar than I would for a second-hand gum shield, and that'll slow them down a bit. But the Tooth Fairy may in fact be a red herring, though that is an image you won't find on much nursery bed linen. Because to sugar's familiar charges of tooth decay, hyperactivity, and making things my children handle sticky, is now added metabolic syndrome, a raft of life-threatening conditions such as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and diabetes, which together take 3 million lives annually worldwide. And unfortunately, they're not all children. Metabolic syndrome correlates closely... We wondered whether you'd go for that one. Metabolic syndrome correlates closely with obesity and is now second only to tobacco as a global health risk. We have now arrived at a situation where more people worldwide die from being fat than from being thin. Sugar is in almost everything now. Empty your cupboards of food containing sugar and your kitchen will quickly start to resemble a Zimbabwean supermarket. How, for the love of donut, did we get here? Well, as Bill Clinton wisely said, it's the economy, stupid. Although he also said, for God's sake, Hillary, we can't both be president. And indeed, damn it, Monica, I'll never get it to light now. But still, joining me to unpick the trail as ever is the BBC's #1 economic whiz kid. At least he was until good old Whiz became yet another victim of the government's poorly informed and draconian anti-drug legislation. He's Radio 4's host from More or Less and regular FT columnist. Please welcome Tim Harford. Now, Tim, you are a fit young bloke, and I am telling the audience at home that because when you say economist on the radio, some people picture a balding, hunched figure struggling to keep a pipe lit as dandruff spreads across the shoulders of his loosely belted 70s leather jacket. But you're not like that at all, yet. So, just before we get started, on a personal level, do you struggle with sugar addiction?
I have a really sweet tooth, Simon. I love donuts, I love cakes, I love chocolate, but fortunately I'm still quite slim, so there's an economics lesson in there.
Oh, is there? What is that then?
Life's not fair, but I'm doing okay, so I don't care.
Yeah. That is indeed the bottom line. I also need to introduce at this point my series guinea pig, Andy, the blank slate on which to scribble the economic impact of sugar. Now, Andy, I believe you've genuinely not eaten any sugar for quite some time, is that right?
Well, basically since we started doing the research for this show.
Well, that's nearly a month now. I thought not eating sugar was supposed to make you look healthy.
But I have been working with you for all that time.
We're going to start you off with a donut, honey and chocolate combo. You've got those three items there, a kind of sugar buffet. It's 1 part American cop, 1 part Winnie the Pooh and 1 part teenage girl who's just been dumped. You have been going without sugar for a month, Andy. Our current consumption of sugar here in the UK is over 30 kilograms per person per year. That is roughly a whole bag every 12 days and more than 4 times what it was 100 years ago. We thought it was about time that your consumption caught up with the rest of us. So get that lot down your neck and we will discuss the chemistry of this substance. Sugar, for our purposes, is any product which contains in roughly equal balance molecules of glucose, which is the body's ultimate source of energy, and fructose, which is mainly there to make you fat and give you diabetes. It's not always called sugar, of course. In fact, there are over 50 different words for sugar currently doing business in British food labelling. Sugar is to us what snow is to the Eskimo. Aliases include agave nectar, barley malt, blackstrap molasses, and so on. All very handy, of course, if you hope to hide its presence from all but the most eagle-eyed of harassed mothers. And it is certainly not possible to use common sense to determine whether a food product like Mrs. Bakerwife's traditional sweet and sour venison Wellington might contain more or less sugar than a custard donut. In my experience, the only way to discover whether or not a food product contains too much sugar is to give it to your kids and see if they ask to have it again. If they do, it does. Tim, I believe there are some economic principles about how small you have to make the type to avoid it being red and the difficulties of encouraging people to eat healthily and so on.
Well, there's this field of behavioural economics, which is basically trying to apply psychological ideas to economic policy. And one of the things they're trying to do now is, because the small print doesn't work very well, they're introducing what they call a traffic light system. The trouble is, think about Coca-Cola. It's low in salt, it's low in fat, it's low in saturated fat. So when you look at Coca-Cola on the supermarket shelves, there were 3 green lights there. It goes to show how difficult it is to get this labelling right.
We need to talk about the history and the context of sugar to understand how it's become so prevalent, because for most of recorded history, of course, there was no food industry, and indeed there was no obesity. Whether or not that's coincidence, we'll find out. There was often not enough food to get fat on, and when there was, you ate it all, and then you got thin again when it ran out. This was, of course, especially true of seasonal goods like fruit, and they were only around for a month or 2 at a time. You rarely saw obese humans in much the same way that you rarely see an obese squirrel. And if you do, it's probably Dom Jolly. Your tastes were of no importance. Economics determined your meal. The toffs might enjoy the odd imported delicacy, but it would probably have gone off by the time they got to it and they wouldn't know the difference. Hence, brie. In Britain, in the Bronze Age, if you were unhappy gnawing on a parsnip, you go hungry. Breakfast, parsnip. Lunch, parsnip. Birthday, candle in a parsnip. But when spices were discovered, of course, immense fortunes were made because these could be shipped without perishing, and then you could have a spicy parsnip. Historically, sugarcane first appeared in Papua New Guinea, very close to the Spice Islands, in fact, which are a small archipelago made up of Ginger Spice Island, Sporty Spice Island, and Posh Spice Island, which is where they keep the saffron. But throughout my childhood, sugar, however popular, was essentially visible and up front, however. It's not that you couldn't eat too much, but you would generally know what you were up to. The first nation to really buck this trend was, of course, America.
Yes, this really began in 1971. So you had Richard Nixon. He was a man so key to understanding the present-day ubiquity of sugar that really Frost Nixon shouldn't have been a play, it should have been a serving suggestion. Nixon's problem was that American voters were worried about high food prices, and so he got this man in to try to sort out America's agriculture. The agriculture secretary was a man called Earl Butz. He persuaded farmers to grow almost exclusively corn and to grow corn on vast scales, both as cheap human fodder and to feed cattle to make cheap meat and high fructose corn syrup.
But even now, there was still one more piece of Lego to fit into the soft white underfoot of humanity's health. It's a lovely confluence of influences, this. There had been a row for some years in medical circles about rising rates of heart disease, and it was agreed that the cause was furry arteries, which of course sound cute, like Furbies, but are in fact potentially lethal to middle-aged men. Again, like Furbies. What wasn't agreed was which element of our diet was causing our arteries to fur. Now, it would be very easy to portray this dispute as a battle between honourable British scientific work in the tradition of Alan Turing and Doctor Who, and commercially tainted American pseudoscience in the style of Dr. Phil and Flubber. So, let's do that. The British scientist in question was John Yudkin, and he had published a seminal work many years previously entitled Pure, White and Deadly, firmly identifying sugar as the culprit of many modern diseases. He questioned why sugar made rats, and indeed humans on the rare occasions he was allowed to experiment on them, basically eat until they burst. And he thought this might be an issue worth addressing. However, American nutritionist Ansel Keys had conducted a study into blood cholesterol levels around the world compared to the consumption of fat in that part of the world. The 7 countries he famously illustrated his conclusive anti-fat theory with were culled from 22 that he had actually studied, the other 15 of which, irritatingly, did not support his thesis and so were casually dumped. This is a matter of record now. For instance, he disregarded the Inuit or Eskimo people who may have 50 words for snow but have only one for food, which is blubber. And yet, they have heart attacks about as often as they strip off for hot dog leg selfies by the fishing pool. Eating fat makes you fat. As a rigorous scientific hypothesis, this was up there with such research papers as He Who Smelt It Dealt It and Beans, Good for the Heart. Predictably, however, the Yanks lapped it up, and pausing only to traduce poor John Yudkin for his silly obsession with good old American sugar, they launched the War on Fat. Well, the War on Fat was about as successful as most of America's other wars against abstract notions and non-state-maintained militia. Tim.
The message was sent out to eat carbohydrates instead of eating fat, and unfortunately most Americans focused on the eat carbohydrates bit more than the instead of eating fat bit. So they began to expand like human weather balloons without showing any appreciable improvement on the heart attack front. So then the government pressed the food industry to offer low-fat alternatives to regular food, and this is where the food industry got really clever. So the food industry realised low-fat is actually a great business opportunity. Selling overpackaged food-like substances at twice the price of actual food seems like a tough sell. But if you can say, well, this is a new low-fat version of actual food, then you have a good reason why you're paying for a microwavable box with a cartoon monkey on the front. Ka-ching!
Now, this is interesting because the trouble is, if you remove fat from food, you also remove the taste. Fat is where the taste lingers on the tongue, and it's almost as if nature intends us to eat the stuff. It's weird, huh? So, in order to make fatless food edible, let alone tasty again, they added sugar, or rather, because US farmers were now growing vast quantities of corn and it was mounting up all over the place, they added a new sugary corn extract called high fructose corn syrup, which was basically sugar at 2/3 the price. Is that right?
That is right, and people took to high fructose corn syrup, or rather manufacturers did, in an awful hurry. So between the mid-1970s and around 1990, the amount of sugar consumption in the States that was high fructose corn syrup went up from about 5% to nearly 50%. So high fructose corn syrup basically cornered the sugar market.
Suddenly, America has now created the perfect food storm, even better than the one in Animal House. They had welcomed in their deadliest foe. They were pumping it into their foods like there was no tomorrow, which for millions of newly diabetic Americans was alarmingly plausible. And they were marketing it, initially at least in good faith, as the healthy option. This is extraordinary. This was the first time that sugar, even in America, was so prevalent in all 4 courses of a meal: the starter, the main course, the dessert, and the drink. Finally, it had arrived. The 4-course menu of the apocalypse. Thank you. If I told you that the entire series has basically been building up to that line, I wouldn't be exaggerating by much. But so, whereas before Americans used to eat until they were full and then maybe just a little bit more for luck, now they ate without ceasing, and it all comes down to fructose. Half of regular sugar and half of high fructose corn syrup is fructose, and the biochemistry of fructose in humans is complex, even by biochemical standards. I could attempt an explanation, but to be honest, on radio and hopefully at home, a couple of glasses to the good by now, chances are, much like your mitochondria, when confronted by the stuff, you won't absorb it. So, here is a marginally oversimplified bottom line. Due to the nature of insulin, leptin, and your poor overworked hypothalamus, your body, it seems, does not metabolize fructose in the same way it does every other molecule of carbohydrate. It struggles to make sense of it. And so while it packs it onto your liver as fat to deal with later, you simultaneously don't know you've eaten it and desperately want some more. And that is the genius of fructose. It is built-in obsolescence as food. The minute you've eaten it, you need an upgrade. Meanwhile, it makes everything taste so damn palatable, it just isn't worth bothering to do anything else to make food appealing. If you're the food industry, this is such a win-win situation. And it is, to be fair, the spirit of the age everywhere. Why bother writing a decent movie when CGI can make a crap one sell perfectly well? Why bother writing a new song when you can sample an old one and do some mumbling over it? Tim, I believe you have an economic theory that accounts for this as well.
This idea is adverse selection. The classic example of adverse selection is the second-hand car market. So you've got second-hand cars that work perfectly well, and you've got second-hand cars that don't work well. And the trouble is, the seller knows which are the good ones and which are the bad ones, and the buyer hasn't got a clue. So they won't be willing to pay much for them. The same thing, I think, is true of high fructose corn syrup and other sugars in food. They make the food taste better. We can't tell whether they're in the food or not very easily. And there's absolutely no mileage in the food industry making good, honest food that actually tastes nice, because we can't tell the difference.
It's a hard thing to get your head round conceptually, even here, where we haven't been exposed to the propaganda. But if fat is good and sugar is bad, we need to start dropping words like sweet to describe sweet little girls and use the word fat instead. It's going to be a brave person who tries it out the first time. Just one more example of how the hip-hop community is light years ahead of us, of course. Time to go over to see how Andy is getting on. I've been hearing very agreeable and promising chomping sounds in my left ear. How do you feel now, Andy? You got through a donut. You've had a couple of biscuits.
I've had 2 donuts, half a packet of biscuits, and a third of the pack of chocolate.
Marvellous.
I feel really happy.
And hungry? Do you feel hungry?
I'm really hungry.
It's important experimentally that you feel hungry. We're going to fake those results if they don't come through. But now, chocolate and honey is a very British approach to sugar. So we're going to move you on to something more all-American now. I've got something over here. I don't know if any of you have children. These are something called Fruit Loops. Fruit there is spelt F-R-O-O-T. I imagine for much the same reason that Iron Brew isn't spelt as if it actually contains ferrous metals. But the Kellogg's website says that they are a fun part of a complete breakfast. So it's either Fruit Loops or porridge on a bouncy castle. Your choice. Incredibly, there is a non-sugar version as well, which is actually just some colouring pencils and a hole punch. Anyway. Now, one person who would disapprove of my experimenting with poor old Andy is David Gillespie, who's author of the book Sweet Poison, Why Sugar Makes Us Fat. I started by asking him how he views sugar.
Sugar is, I guess, a lethal and highly addictive substance that's been added to our food supply without our consent. Manufacturers pretty quickly figured out that we really, really love it and that we will be much more likely to buy something if it's got a lot of sugar in it. And so they keep obliging us and putting more and more sugar in it.
That's not just children, that's adults as well. You think we're all addicted equally?
Oh, absolutely. It's the only highly addictive substance that we give to 2-year-olds and 1-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds. It's embedded in our food supply so substantially now that it is almost impossible to avoid it.
So sugar is the only thing that babies like as much as adults, except, of course, breasts, which might explain Kellogg's new Sugar Tits range. Currently in beta. I then asked him whether he thought sugar was addictive.
Anyone who's ever tried to stop eating sugar will tell you it's addictive because they feel like garbage. They have mood swings, they have depression, they have what's often called the sugar quitter's flu for 2 to 4 weeks. You don't get that when you give up on lettuce. It's only with sugar.
So best to stay away from Andy for the next few days as he comes down off this high, especially as he's currently trying to give up smoking after a previous episode. But set against a couple of weeks of discomfort, what are the consequences of not quitting?
The diseases which flow from consuming too much fructose are disastrous. It wrecks your organs one by one. They are now at truly epidemic levels. We've gone in Australia from having 200,000 people suffering from type 2 diabetes in the early 1980s to having 1.4 million suffering from them now. If I was talking about Ebola with those statistics, we'd all be hoarded up in our basement with a shotgun and a can of baked beans. But with type 2 diabetes, which today caused 9 people in Australia to lose a limb to amputation and will cause another 9 to lose one tomorrow and another 9 the day after that, that is just the tip of the iceberg. You add in similar statistics on fatty liver disease, cirrhosis of the liver, chronic kidney disease, heart disease, hypertension, all of those, adding those together, and there is no alternative view but that it is killing us and killing us swiftly.
Still, the good news is we are losing weight. The bad news is it's by losing limbs. Now, in Australia, David Gillespie is part of a growing anti-sugar movement, but I wondered if the industry is starting to take notice.
At the moment, what they're doing is starting to pay attention. There's an old rule in marketing, which is when 6% of your customers care about something, then you need to pay attention. And when 20% of your customers care about something, you need to change what you're doing. I think we're somewhere between 6 and 20% here because we're starting to see some brands coming out with low sugar versions or no sugar versions of their products. And that means that a lot of people care.
But is there a cover-up as such?
There are elements of the processed food industry, particularly the big end of town, and I'm talking to people who are making billions and billions of dollars a year out of this stuff. So the soft drink manufacturers, the confectionery manufacturers, the breakfast cereal manufacturers, they all know exactly what's going on. They are using plays from the tobacco playbook over and over and over again. Everything from sponsoring sort of front organisations to paying off experts like professors and dietitians and so on to getting involved in government discussions about these sorts of things. And you're seeing that over and over again in the United Kingdom as we are in Australia and as they are in the United States. Every now and then it sneaks its head to the surface and you see it in a newspaper headline, but it's there all the time. So that end of town know exactly what they're doing and they are trying very, very hard to slow down any move towards removing sugar.
The food industry is making a lot of money, but can we get a slice of the banoffee pie? That's the question. So I spoke to Merryn Somerset-Webb, editor of Money Week. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us live tonight because the life of a Money Week editor is impossibly glamorous and she's probably yachting in the Aegean or avoiding Prince Andrew on Mystique. But by satellite phone to her yacht, I started by asking whether there is any money to be made from investing in sugar.
Sugar is a little like tobacco a decade ago, 2 decades ago, in that the governments are just beginning to realise what an impact it has on health. And so just beginning to start talking about taxing sugar, taxing products with sugar in them, etc. So it's a dangerous area to start looking at the moment. So I'd be very careful investing in sugar.
And those rumblings you can hear from the stock market are Warren Buffett pulling out of wagon wheels. Can you really tax sugar?
Sure you can. I mean, you can tax anything you like. And already there's conversations about taxing, fizzy drinks, for example, which are, pure evil, aren't they, really? Fizzy drinks. Then you start taxing pure candy, you start taxing chocolates, and then next thing you know, you're taxing jam. So it's a slippery slope.
Well, of course, if it's jam, it's actually a sticky slope, which isn't nearly as dangerous. But what about investing in sugar alternatives?
But there are lots of interesting sugar substitutes out there which are worth looking at. I mean, some of them not very pleasant, some of them pleasant. There's one which I'm quite interested in called xylitol, which is produced by all sorts of people, actually, and it's derived from the bark of the birch tree. And the brilliant thing about it is that it has no effect on blood sugar at all. So if you eat pure xylitol, it has absolutely no effect on your blood sugar, which for diabetics, for example, is amazing and quite good for the rest of us.
If you're not a qualified biochemist, what about weight loss systems or liposuction as an investment?
Cosmetic surgery in general is booming, both in the UK and, going abroad to get cheaper treatments. And so if you can find a way to invest in liposuction, I'm sure it'll be a fabulous investment going forward.
So Merryn suggests you shy away from sugar as much financially as physically, but then professional investors like car mechanics do have a financial interest in lying to you. In this case, to keep all the sugar stocks for herself, perhaps. If she turns up to the 3rd series in a tiara, we'll know we've been had. Let's go back to Andy. How are you feeling now, Andy?
Oh, I'm not blinking as much as I'd like. My insides are beating like a drum.
Nice.
Yeah.
Andy's body was a temple, ladies and gentlemen, but sugar has well and truly gone in and turned over all the tables. There's an old saying that sex sells, and in food terms, sugar is sex. It's there in fruit to make you eat fruit, because making you eat fruit is how certain plants reproduce. It's their plunging neckline. It's their pert buttocks. But lashing that appeal to every third-rate food product you want to shift or store or export has been an unmitigated disaster for mankind. And what was once a treat has become a fix, like any other, with health consequences to match. For simple economic gain, the food industry has shown utter disregard for people's health and the limits of their control. Arguably, they're even worse than tobacco. At least when you smoke, you look cool. No one looks cool eating a donut. And unlike drinking, you don't even have a memorable time when you're eating sugar. You may have a brief dopamine rush, but you don't pluck up the courage to ask someone out, or indeed to ask someone outside, which does at least provide a good laugh for your mate. Invest in sugar by all means, but my guess is weight loss schemes are going to be a safe bet for many years to come. Invest soundly and maybe you can afford to go and live somewhere where the sugar occurs naturally and all you have to do is chew. So, what have we learned? Sugar is about as dangerous a substance as you can imagine, to the extent that it might be our best hope to beat Islamic State is a huge airdrop of trifles. If little girls really are made of sugar and spice and all things nice, they're going to die early from fatty liver disease. David Gillespie's tactic in an Ebola epidemic is to hole up with a tin of beans. He'd also take a shotgun, which isn't a bad idea, but I'd suggest a tin opener. We all know the dangers. After all, that's why we all know the lyrics, sweets for my sweet, sugar for my honey. I've got diabetes and my teeth have gone funny. Thank you very much. Good night. Listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market, where I was joined by Tim Harford, David Gillespie and Merryn Somerset-Webb. It was written by me, Simon Evans, with Guy Venables, Benjamin Partridge and Andy Walton, and the producer was Claire Jones. It was a BBC Radio comedy production.